This happened to me about a year ago today, which is why I'm writing about it now. I'm a 19-year-old college student that was in the middle of joining a fraternity on my campus. I go to a big party school down south, and Greek life is taken very seriously there. For privacy reasons, I'll spare the specific details, but this particular night was my initiation, meaning the night that me and my class of 20 students would officially become brothers of the fraternity. During the process of joining, which lasts a couple of months, the brothers would make us do odd things like blindfold us and take us to strange places. You know, typical hazing stuff. This was one of those nights. We were blindfolded and left the frat house around 10:30 p.m. The brothers took our phones and drove us to a mystery location, split between a couple of different cars to make sure we all got there. On the way over, they made us try and sing some corny song while it blasted on full volume. We always had to do these annoying tasks while blindfolded, I guess as part of the whole hazing thing. Anyway, after about 20 minutes of driving, the car stopped, and I heard the doors open and close. I felt a hand grab my arm and silently usher me out of the car. We walked probably 200 feet, where I was then told to sit down and be quiet. I was sitting on grass, so I assumed we were in a field or something. I could also tell I was sitting near people because I heard them sit down, and I also heard the brothers telling each of them to be quiet. After about a minute of sitting in silence, I heard a voice speak to all of us, saying a bunch of fraternity-related things, but mostly about how we were deemed worthy of becoming a part of the brotherhood. Then, over the course of like 30 minutes, I sat in silence, occasionally hearing the sound of footsteps and movement around me. I figured they might have been doing the final steps of initiation with each person individually, like walking them away to talk to them in private. I didn't know for sure, but being blindfolded meant I was just left to my imagination. There was a time when the footsteps went away, and all I was left with were the sounds of crickets and leaves rustling through the night breeze. I began to grow uncomfortable as it must have been like 20 minutes that I was sitting there in silence. Then suddenly, I finally heard the footsteps of one of the brothers walk up to me, and I felt a hand grab my wrist and lead me away. He didn't say a word, and neither did I. I just wanted to get it over with so I could take the stupid blindfold off. While we walked, I could feel the ground below me go from grass to more rough terrain. I could tell we were walking through a forest as I felt branches and shrubs scrape against my body. We were walking for some time, and at one point, the blindfold became very uncomfortable around my eyes. I told him this and asked if we could stop for a second so I could adjust it. He stopped and let go of me as I stood there rubbing my eyes from under the blindfold. I heard a deep, raspy voice say, "Take it off." I hesitated for a second, not knowing what to say. His voice threw me off, as it didn't sound like a voice I recognized. Needless to say, I took it off, and what I was greeted with was not what I imagined. I was standing face to face with some tall guy dressed in all black, wearing a vendetta mask. I let out a sharp yell and jumped back. A part of me thought this was just some messed up hazing prank, but before a word could even escape my mouth, he lunged at me, yelling that he was going to take me with him. We wrestled on the ground, and I could tell he was trying to choke me out. With all my strength, I threw him off of me, got up, and bolted in the opposite direction, using nothing but moonlight to guide my way back. My heart was beating 1,000,000 times a minute, and I kept looking back, fearing that he was following me. I eventually heard people yelling my name and nearly ran head-on into one of the fraternity brothers. I told him in scrambled, broken words that some random guy wearing a mask had led me into the forest and tried fighting me. But before I could warn them any further, 5 or 6 of them rushed past me with flashlights, looking to chase after him. One of them stayed with me to calm me down and walk me back to safety. When we made it out of the woods, I realized we were in a backyard, presumably one of the brothers' houses. I saw nearly the whole fraternity standing out on the porch, looking at us in shock. I asked them what the hell was going on. They said that since it was dark and I was the last in line, the brother who was supposed to be escorting me had somehow overlooked that I was there and completely forgot about me. They said a couple of minutes later, one of them thought they saw movement in the woods, which was around the same time that they realized I wasn't in my group. I was in such shock I couldn't even be pissed about it. None of them knew who that man was, but some of the brothers speculated it could have been a brother from another fraternity. Shortly after, flashlights emerged from the trees, and I saw them running back towards us. They told everyone to get the hell out of there and get back to the campus immediately. They didn't ask questions, they locked up the house, and one of them got on the phone with the police. The whole car ride back, I was bombarded with questions, and I answered them the best I could with my mind still racing. I wondered where that man came from, why he was wearing a mask, and what he could have been leading me to. I made up scenarios in my head, like how it could have been a brother from a rival fraternity trying to steal me before I was initiated. That doesn't explain why the brothers locked up the house and called the police, though. I didn't find out until the next day when one of the brothers who ran after him told me what they found in those woods, and what they found was not what I expected. As they were running, they saw a light in the distance. They grew silent when they got closer and realized it was a bonfire in the middle of a clearing. Standing around the fire were several people dressed in all black and wearing white vendetta masks, chanting and throwing things into the fire. One of the brothers stepped on a loud branch, causing all of the masked men to turn and face them. They froze up like something straight out of a horror movie. The mysterious men suddenly started running in their direction. They fled and made it back, where they told everyone else to leave and call the police. It seemed as though we had somehow walked ourselves into some cult ritual meeting of some sort. I couldn't sleep for many nights after and tried my best to rid my mind of the situation. However, something that I heard from the fraternity a few days later sent shivers down my spine. While a few of them were playing football in the backyard of that same house, they found a white vendetta mask hanging from a tree nearby. They called the police, and the cops took it for evidence and examination. I'm not sure if those guys were ever caught or if the police even made anything of it. I'm also not sure what the hell those weird people were doing in those woods. I've been thinking about this experience a lot recently, and I'm glad that I was left with nothing more than a crazy story. It was junior year of high school and it was the last day of school. A lot of people cut school this day or left early after lunch period. My friends and I were some of the latter. It was a stormy, dark day. A bunch of people from our grade originally planned to hit the beach on the last day of school, but that was obviously canceled. So my smaller core group of friends decided to do something else. There used to be an abandoned elementary school in town that hadn't been used for like 10 years. There were plans to tear it down by the year's end. So, still wanting to do something fun on the last day of school, we all agreed to break into the building and just around exploring. There were no cameras in that old building, and on a stormy day, no one would be outside monitoring the place or anything. So we all left after lunch period. Our friend Darius already had a car and his license, so he drove us all to the abandoned school. The school was in the middle of a neighborhood, not on any main roads for anything. There was a back parking lot covered by overgrown bushes and trees on one side and the walls of the school on two other sides. It was a perfect spot to park and go unnoticed. The place wasn't boarded up or anything, it was just locked up. Darius had a baseball bat in his trunk that he took out to smash one of the windows of the school. I was honestly so nervous that even through the pouring rain, one of the houses over the fence would hear the smashing sound. We all watched and nervously laughed as Darius swung the bat into the window in front of the car. After a few good swings, smashing it, he pushed away the stray pieces of glass stuck to the frame with a bat, and then he waved us over. We one by one climbed through the window into the school. My logic was that the school was being torn down anyway. What's a broken window matter? We all were inside the building now. The window we climbed through was actually one of the windows for a classroom. A lot of stuff was still left in the room, including the desks and some decorations on the walls. Based on the decorations, it looked like we were in a 4th or 5th grade classroom. It was very surreal to be inside of what was once an active classroom where little kids would come to learn, now nothing but a cold, dark, and abandoned room, collecting dust, waiting to be destroyed. The sounds of thunder and lightning outside also added to the surreal feeling of it all. There were no lights on in the building. Power to the place was likely cut completely. We anticipated this, though. The flashlights on our phones were plenty to get around and see. Even without them, it wasn't completely pitch black in there, as even though it was a dark day, some light was still creeping in through the windows and doors. We started traversing the hallways, going from room to room. Each classroom was still full of desks and chairs that hadn't been sat in for probably a decade. We all 4 were in the same classroom when there was a sound that echoed down the hallway and into the classroom. We all went silent and turned off our lights for a moment. After a flash of lightning, we slowly accepted that it was probably nothing, so we continued on. We just went from room to room as our wet shoes all squeaked on the floors. Sneaking around wasn't really possible. A lot of things in the school were visibly decaying. You could really tell no one had stepped foot in there in ages. As we neared the corner of the hall, I turned around just to look back down the other way. At the doorway of one of the classrooms, it looked like there was something sticking out from the classroom. I asked my friends to also look. Their lights might help see what it was. When all 4 of us were pointing our phone flashlights toward the door, whatever that thing we were seeing was retracted into the classroom. All 4 of us quietly went, "Oh," amongst ourselves, and we started running down the intersecting hallway. We stopped when we were far enough away. It seemed we were in the kindergarten wing now. Then we heard another sound echo from down the hallway. It seemed we weren't alone, but who could be in here was the question. The place was locked up and every light in the building was off. The sound scared us into going into the first classroom we could find and shutting the door. It was indeed a kindergarten classroom. We were now concerned we'd get in trouble, so we waited in silence with our flashlights off. The rain was still coming down hard, and there was still thunder and lightning crashing every 20 seconds or so. Suddenly, the door to the classroom clicked open, and someone pushed it as it eerily creaked to a fully open position. We didn't see anyone at the doorway, though, and the hallway was almost pitch black. We all tried our best to stay quiet, and then slowly something appeared through the doorway. It was the shape of a head. We all saw it, and when there was another flash of lightning, we saw what it was. It was, in fact, someone's head looking into the classroom directly at us. I started apologizing for all of us, saying we're leaving. The person at the doorway didn't move. They motionlessly and almost lifelessly just peered around the doorway into the classroom. Darius asked, "Do you work here?" No response. Darius had to this moment clearly. He handed me the bat as he struggled to unlock one of the windows to slide it open just enough to crawl through. He crawled out first, then my other two friends, and I was last. Before I crawled out, I looked back one more time at the head at the doorway. I crawled through as quickly as I could, fearing I'd hear the person run up behind me and grab my legs. Once I was out, I ran to catch up with my friends who were already booking it back to Darius's car. We drove out of there in a hurry and never looked back. The building was torn down later that year and has since been turned into a park. We never got in trouble for breaking in. To this day, we have no idea if that was some kind of worker or just some random person. Either way, it was extremely creepy behavior on their part. When I was a freshman in college, I took a chemistry class. It was really difficult for me. The tables were arranged in groups of 4. I sat at a middle table, at the left side all the way to the end. Next to me was a guy named Albert. He was very awkward. He gave me Reddit moderator vibes. To describe his appearance, he was like 5 feet 8 inches, a little overweight, and had a really ugly patchy beard, but he knew his stuff in chemistry. I think he was just good in school overall. We started to talk in a pretty cordial way when he noticed I was struggling in class. I would ask him for help, and he started offering to do my homework for me. He even let me cheat off him on tests. I never got any kind of flirtatious vibes from Albert, but that might have been because he was just too awkward to flirt in person. He eventually asked for my number so that he could send me homework-related stuff. Obviously, I gave it to him. He was helping me out a ton and didn't give off any threatening vibes. He just seemed a little reclusive. Fast forward to the last day of class, and Albert did something completely unexpected. He asked me if I wanted to go on a date with him after class. I had no physical attraction to Albert in the slightest, and our personalities were complete opposites. But he did help me throughout the semester maintain an A, so I had to let him down super politely. I lied and told him I was going away to Miami for the next couple of weeks and wouldn't be around. He right away responded, "What about when you get back?" I felt like 2 weeks was long enough of a gap in seeing each other where he would probably lose interest, so I said, "Yeah, I could be around," or something like that. He responded with a really cringy, "Cool," as he nodded his head in response. From here till the end of class that day was really awkward for me. After class, I left straight for my car and drove right home. I was a commuter, not a dormer, so after the last day of class was over, that was it. It was Thursday, and my other friends who went to the same school wanted to go out that night, so we hit town. At some point, I got a text from Albert. He asked, "When are you going to Miami?" I told my friends all about Albert while we were drunk, how he got me an A, but now he wanted a date. My friends joked that I should just go on the date with him to be nice. I joked back sarcastically, "Yeah, for sure." I told myself I'd respond to it later, but I was drunk and completely forgot. The next day, I woke up to 2 follow-up texts, one with question marks, and then the next one, "You're going to ignore me now that you don't need me anymore, right?" So I replied, "Hey, I'm sorry, I was packing. I'm going to Miami today." He replied almost instantly, saying, "Okay." Obviously, there was no Miami trip, but he shouldn't have found that out. Later that night, my girls and I went out again. While out, I got a scary text from Albert saying, "I thought you said you were going to Miami tonight." I almost dropped my drink when I saw this. I showed it to my girls, and they were all freaked out just like I was. I replied to Albert, "What do you mean?" And he replied, "Nothing, forget it. I just don't like liars." I genuinely was scared that I was being stalked. I looked around the whole bar, but he wasn't there, at least as far as I knew. So, what the hell, I just didn't answer at that point. I never planned on answering him again. It was until late that night, shortly after I got home, like literally taking my shoes off inside, that there were knocks at the door. It had to be like 1 a.m. I said, "Who is it?" And it was Albert on the other side. He said, "It's me." I wanted to scream. I was home alone. I yelled through the door to leave or my dad would come out and kick his ass. That seemed to work, as he didn't knock again. I texted everyone I knew about the situation, my family, all my friends. I was horrified. Some suggested calling the police. I said I would go to the nearest station tomorrow, but tomorrow didn't even come yet when I received a super long, disgustingly weird, and creepy text from guess who. I was appalled when I picked up my phone and read it. This is what it said: "I'm feeling a lot of emotions right now after being used by someone for months and then lied to. Hurt and anger are two of them. I thought from the start of the semester in chemistry class that our chemistry was through the roof, no pun intended. I must say I am hurt that you would make up something as elaborate as a 2-week Miami trip just to avoid going out with me, even after I stuck my neck out for you all semester and risked my own academic standing. I definitely have noticed the way you looked at me sometimes in class, and I can't pretend there wasn't a hint of interest there. All I'm asking for at this point is for one date. That's it. I'm not asking for your hand in marriage, though I surely would be quite an ideal husband to have if I do say so myself. I'm going to give you the benefit of the doubt that you needed more time to think over the prospect of going on a date with me. I know how much I have to offer, much more than these losers all over campus. If you want, I can come back to your house, and we can talk about it in person. I am only making this offer once. I'm just very crushed to feel like I wasted so much this semester for nothing in return. Yours truly, Albert." I sent this to everyone. I didn't care that it was 3 a.m. I called my dad until he picked up, and I told him how scared I was. After he read the text, he took it upon himself to send a lengthy text of his own and attempted to call him like 10 times, but Albert was clearly too much of a coward to pick up that phone call. I also went to the police station the next day with the text saying I wanted to press charges, and one of the people working there said that Albert would be contacted. Albert never picked up any of the calls from the police who were trying to get him to come in for questioning, nor did he answer any of their text messages. Albert completely disappeared. I never heard from him again. Between the police contacting him and my dad's pretty scary texts and voicemails, that basement-dwelling creep was probably himself. Luckily, I never saw him on campus again or anything like that, but I can say I know what it's like to deal with an actual stalker. I live in Burke County, North Carolina, in Morganton. I'm used to the quiet lifestyle that comes with living in a rural place. You get some weird characters here and there, but it's usually nothing too bad. I own a nice plot of land with my husband. My work schedule fluctuates. Sometimes I work days, sometimes I work nights. This happened on a night that I was on my way home after a night shift, so it had to be like 4 a.m. My phone was almost dead. I was hungry. I was tired, and I just wanted to get some food and head home. I stopped at the gas station to get $10 worth of gas and also a packaged sandwich, which I proceeded to eat inside the gas station cafe. Some sketchy guy was eyeing me for a little until he left the building without buying anything. After eating, I went outside to fill up the gas and then got back in the car. The smell of gas was extra pungent for some reason. These roads are very dark and twisty at night, so I was driving slow, especially since I was tired after a long day of work. Then something unexpected happened. The needle on the gas gauge suddenly dropped to E, and the low gas light came on and beeped. I had no idea what was going on. I'm not a car person and I'd never run out of gas before this. Plus, the needle just suddenly dropped. I thought at first that the computer was glitching, so I pulled over and restarted the car, but the needle was still on E. I tried to continue driving, but the engine died. I started having a panic attack. I called my husband first thing, and thank God he picked up. I asked him how did my car run out of gas after I just filled up, and as I got out of the car, I smelt gasoline. I told him this, and he said it sounds like I have a leak. He told me he'd head right over and he'd call our roadside assistance company. But then I heard a car coming with no headlights, and suddenly it stopped not far behind my car. I suddenly thought to bring up that sketchy guy who was watching me at the gas station and asked my husband if there was a chance he did something to my car. My husband's tone suddenly changed to sounding more concerned and worried. He said yes, there's a chance that he may have cut my fuel line. I didn't know what that meant. All I knew was I needed to run. I took my keys out of the ignition and shut the door and locked it so that the headlights would turn off. My phone was on like 2%, so I told him to text me when he's close. I ran off the road and towards the first house I could find. I ran down the long driveway and up the property to the front door. All the lights in the house were off. I still rang the bell multiple times anyway. Eventually, a light turned on and then the door opened. A man in his 60s opened the door. He looked like he was just woken up. I asked him to let me in to hide and charge my phone. After a bit of explaining, he opened the door fully and let me in. I asked him for an iPhone charger, and he said he'd go look for one, then asked me to take a seat in the living room. I sat down, still in my nurse scrubs, feeling a mix of emotions. The man called out from the kitchen asking me if I wanted some water. I said yes, please. Little did he know, I saw his reflection in a mirror in the living room that gave visibility into the kitchen. I saw him fill a cup with water, then I know for a fact I saw him drop something into the water. He walked out of view of the mirror, but the faucet was still running. It ran for a solid 30 more seconds before he turned it off. He came back into the living room with a glass of water and handed it to me. I thanked him, and he sat down and just looked at me, then asked me to explain the situation again. I replied to him, I just really need a charger so that I could contact my husband. He said all right and went upstairs. I checked my phone, and it was on 1%. I used that remaining battery to send my current location to my husband just in case. I then smelt the glass of water, and although it didn't smell like anything, I knew he put something in it. Now I had to make the decision of whether I should leave or not. On one hand, I needed to charge my phone badly. On the other, I was 99% sure he did something to this water. I heard him walking back down the stairs, and he said he doesn't have any iPhone chargers since he has an Android. After he said this, I got up and walked straight for the door. I'm not an idiot. Once outside, I ran back down the driveway to the road. I felt like throwing up. I couldn't believe two separate potential incidents from two different men happened in one night. I crept along the side of the road behind the trees. I took out my phone and sent my updated location, and right around now was when my battery died. I waited until I saw the familiar headlights of my husband's truck. I went out waving my arms, and thank God it was him. I got inside the truck and let all my emotions out, crying to him about what I just went through. He brought us to my car, and there was no longer a car behind mine. My back window was shattered, though, and it appeared someone had gotten into the back seat, but nothing of high value was left in my car to steal anyway. My car battery was also now dead. When I told my husband about the man who tried to potentially drug me, he was so furious he wanted to go break down his door. But I told him no, let's just wait for the tow truck to come. We waited quite a while before it came. My car was towed to my dealership, where they would take the car in the next day. My husband was right. My car was vandalized, and the fuel line was cut completely. Thank God I was off the next few days because I needed some time to mentally recover from this night. The idea that twice in one night I was almost a victim of some sketchy men, I just couldn't get over. We started in New Jersey, where we're from, and made our way west. It was a great time. We saw stuff that we always talked about seeing. After day 3, we finally hit the dreaded boring part of the drive, Nebraska. Nothing but cornfields as far as the eye can see. It was about 6:30 p.m., and the sun was starting to set. I looked at the gas gauge, and it read 1/4 of a tank. I told my buddy we should start looking for a gas station. He checked the GPS, and nothing for at least 100 miles showed up. I started to get nervous because the last thing we need is to run out of gas in the middle of Nebraska with literally nothing around at night. That's how horror movies start. Finally, as we crested a small hill, my fears, at least for the time being, were put to rest. Down the road, maybe half a mile, we saw a blue sign that said, "Gas next exit." Little did I know that the next exit was another 30 miles away. So we drove and drove, all the while with one eye on the gauge. Finally, we saw the exit and got off. The gas light on the dashboard came on, warning us we had less than a gallon left. The sign pointed to the right at the end of the exit ramp and said, 10 miles gas. The car we were driving was a 200 Ford Explorer. Being an old SUV, I knew it barely got 14 miles to the gallon on a good day. I shared a look with my friend, we both shrugged. I made the turn, and we continued on. The sun had now gone down, and for those of you who have never been to the Midwest at night, it's not like being in the city. When the sun goes down, there is no ambient light whatsoever. No street lights, no lights from a major city giving off the comfortable orange glow, nothing. Just an endless darkness in all directions. Even the highway offered no lights. I turned on the high beams and could barely see 50 feet in front of me. My spider sense was tingling at this point, but we pressed on. What other choice did we have? Minutes passed, but they felt like hours. I kept my eyes peeled for any possible animals that might dart out in front of me. Suddenly, the car started to shudder. My friend and I both shared an "oh, look" as we started going up another hill. The car barely made it up and crested the hill. As we did, we saw our salvation, lights from a gas station. If I had only known what was going to happen next, I would have gotten out of the car and run back to the interstate. We rolled down the hill and entered what I can only describe as a ghost town. There were buildings, shops, and houses, every single one of them boarded up. There was one exception, a church set opposite the station. One of those old ones you would usually see in New York or Paris. It appeared to be sandstone with a huge steeple. It looked like it was brand new, with a nicely manicured lawn and a huge red wooden door. The stained glass windows that lined the outside had pictures telling a story. However, instead of telling the story of the Stations of the Cross or the Virgin Mary, as most churches had, These showed depictions of people burning in fire, their faces twisted in agony under the cloven hoof of what I could only think was the devil. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. Something here just didn't feel right. The car died about 500 feet from the gas station, so we got out and pushed it the rest of the way. As we got out, I heard something barely audible, almost like a humming, coming from the church. My buddy didn't hear anything, so I assumed I must just be tired. The pump was new, with one of the credit card readers, which struck me as odd, considering everything else in this town, save the church, looked like it hadn't had anyone living in it for at least 30 years. We filled up without incident, and as we finished, the sound, which now sounded like a humming droning, got louder. We got back into the car and left. The road we came in on was a one-way, so the only way out was to go further into the town and hopefully find a road that led back to the interstate. As we drove, we saw more light being reflected off the buildings. We pulled into a town square where there was a huge stage and hundreds of chairs set up for what looked like a concert of some sort. The light was coming from a bonfire in the center of the audience area. As we pulled further into the square, we could see a guy playing music for no one. There wasn't one person in any of the seats. I used to work in the music industry. I know a sound check when I see one. Usually, that happens before the concert, so a musician can check his or her sound with the guy running the soundboard. With no one around, this was not it. He was covered in sweat, screaming his music and playing almost like his life depended on it. We came to a T-intersection and a stop sign. We had the windows down because it was summer and we were trying to save gas by not using the AC. The droning humming I heard had gotten louder. It was almost like it was in my head, beating my brain. Now it sounded like it was coming from the buildings themselves. It got louder and louder. The guy playing music screamed even louder, almost like he was fighting the sound. Then a whole lot of things happened at once. The humming reached fever pitch and then stopped abruptly. The bonfire went out. The guy on stage stopped playing. Down on the right of the road, which looked like it was the only way back to the highway, came a mob of people with pitchforks, boards, rocks, and one guy had what looked like a samurai sword. Looking back now, I remember thinking it strange that no one had a gun considering where we were. They came running towards us, screaming and waving their weapons. My buddy and I covered our heads in anticipation of the beating of our lives. They started pounding on the car, even going so far as to break one of the little windows in the back seat. I threw the car in four-wheel drive and slammed the accelerator. The car lurched forward, plastering a few people onto the windshield, but ultimately we broke through the mob. The ones who weren't knocked down from the impact of the car started storming the stage. They jumped onto it and started assaulting the musician with their weapons, his screams echoing off the derelict buildings. I didn't waste any time. I slammed on the gas pedal, cut the wheel, and sped out down the road to the right, the whole time with my friend screaming obscenities. We got back to the highway and drove for another 30 miles until we hit our destination for the night, where our hotel was. We got into our room, trying to make sense of what we had just seen. As I put my bags down, I looked at my friend and he looked at me. We both agreed to go to the police in the morning, as it was now about 3 a.m. The next day, we woke up, packed our overnight bags, and went out to our car. We immediately drove to the police department and asked to speak to a detective, as we had a crime to report. A small bald man from a desk stood up and invited us to come and sit with him. We then proceeded to tell him the whole thing. When we were finished, he asked us, pale as a ghost, "Did you tell anyone else this?" We, of course, responded in the negative, to which he replied, "Good. Keep it that way." With his hands shaking, he showed us the door, and we left. We never spoke of it to anyone else. Our next story takes us from the desolate expanse of the desert to the claustrophobic darkness of a dense forest. Imagine the towering trees, their branches intertwined overhead, creating a canopy that blots out the moon and stars. The air is thick with the scent of pine and damp earth, a symphony of rustling leaves and the snapping of twigs. It's a place of eerie beauty, but also one that can hide unspeakable horrors. A young woman driving home from a late-night shift found herself lost on a deserted road cutting through the heart of such a forest. She had taken a wrong turn, lured off the main highway by a faulty GPS signal. Now she was hopelessly lost, her phone showing no bars, and her car sputtering its last breaths as it ran out of gas. The engine died, plunging her into an oppressive silence broken only by the sound of her own ragged breathing. Fear, cold and sharp, gripped her heart. The forest, once beautiful, now loomed around her, menacing and alive. Every rustle of leaves, every snapping twig sounded like approaching footsteps. She knew staying in her car was her safest bet, but the silence of the forest was unbearable, a suffocating blanket of darkness pressing in on her. She turned on her hazard lights, there blinking a beacon of hope in the vast darkness, but the battery quickly drained, leaving her once again in darkness. Time crawled by, each minute an eternity. She dozed off, only to be jolted awake by nightmares fueled by her isolation and fear. The forest came alive with every gust of wind, the shadows seeming to dance and writhe, taking on menacing shapes in the darkness. Then she heard it, a low growl, deep and guttural, coming from the woods surrounding her car. Her blood ran cold, her heart pounding against her ribs like a drum. She strained to listen, her senses on high alert, every muscle in her body tense with fear. The growl came again, closer this time, followed by the distinct sound of heavy footsteps crunching on leaves. Something was out there, something big and dangerous, circling her car like a predator stalking its prey. She locked the doors, her fingers trembling as she fumbled with the lock. She huddled in the back seat, her eyes wide with terror, her breath catching in her throat. The growls continued throughout the night, each one sending shivers down her spine. She was trapped, hunted by an unseen terror in the heart of the forest. As dawn broke, the growls finally ceased, replaced by the chirping of birds, a jarring contrast to the nightmares she had just endured. She cautiously got out of the car, her legs shaking and her body trembling with exhaustion and terror. She didn't waste any time. With a desperate prayer, she started walking, her eyes scanning the dense undergrowth and her ears straining for any sound that might signal the return of her unseen tormentor. After what felt like an eternity, she stumbled out of the woods and onto a dirt road. A pickup truck soon approached, its driver stopping to help. She had escaped the clutches of the forest, but the terror of that night, the memory of the unseen growls, would forever haunt her dreams. It was late afternoon, and I was probably around 10 years of age at the time. I was on my way home from my school football when I realized an odd man was walking along my street. At first, I stopped walking and examined the man for a moment. There was something about him that just did not sit right with me, the way he moved, the way he looked, the way he was looking at things in such definitive detail. I could not really put my finger on it. All I knew was that his presence made me feel extremely uncomfortable. I went and sat behind a car so he could not see me, and I waited for a few moments as he walked into somebody's driveway out of view. I ran back to my house, which was only a few doors down. It did not take me too long to reach my driveway. However, when I stepped onto my driveway, I felt like I was being watched. I did not look back. I rushed into my house to tell my mom and grandparents what I had just seen. Of course, they just brushed it off and made an excuse for it to not be some kind of alien man. I could not be bothered to stand around and try to convince them, so I went up to my room and stared. I stared out the window for a while, and then there they were. My window looks out into the driveway, so I could see him clearly. He was tall, maybe 6'5" or so, and extremely skinny. His neck was abnormally long, and his shoulders were narrow. He wore a white sports jersey and a pair of baggy jeans. The top of his head was large and veiny. Overall, he was a weird-looking person. I bolted downstairs with the most intense adrenaline rush I had ever had to tell my family. Out of breath, I stuttered out my words, and they walked out into the living room to take a look for themselves. My mom's face turned pale as she stared into the eyes of the person who was now stood up right against the living room window, so close, in fact, that you could see the condensation from his breath on the glass. He gently pulled up a notebook from his pocket and started writing. As this happened, everything was quiet, and everybody was frozen in place. It was the eeriest atmosphere I have ever experienced. A few seconds passed, and he finished taking his notes. He strolled back to the driveway. Still pale, my mom turned to me with an expression of terror and complexion. The only thing we knew to do from here was to contact the police, which we did. However, they looked for this man all over the neighborhood and could not find him anywhere. Overall, this experience has probably been one of the most bizarre and terrifying I have ever had. I am hoping someone can help me figure out what happened here. I'm hoping somebody can tell me who or what this thing was. I've read a lot of things online, and this sounds a lot like abductions I've heard in the past. Luckily, I didn't get abducted, but what do you guys think? My island on June 28, 1947, Captain Tony, who worked as a harbor patrolman officer in Ireland, was on patrol with his 2 rookies, his son, and his dog. However, this was no ordinary day at sea. When Tony gazed up into the sky from his patrol boat, he saw 6 aircraft floating around 1,500 feet above his watercraft. The objects were reported by Tony and his crew to be made of a reflective material and were shaped like flat donuts, about 100 feet in diameter. The center holes located on each craft were noted to be about 25 feet in diameter, and more circular objects were located along the sides of the aircraft, which Tony and his crew determined to be observation windows. Soon, Tony and his fellow crewmen noticed that 5 of the UFOs circled over the 6th, and the 6th itself was lowering towards the patrol boat. This caused immense panic among the crew because they all thought that the aircraft was going to collide with their patrol boat. Not wanting to be sent to a watery grave, the crew hightailed it toward the shore. Upon reaching the shore, Tony retrieved his binoculars to spot the bizarre aircraft from the shore. He also grabbed his camera to take photos as evidence of the strange aircraft. While taking the pictures, the lower craft stayed in a still position while the 5 others circled around it for about 5 minutes. Then, the lower aircraft suddenly dropped down but stopped abruptly at about 500 feet above the water. One of the 5 ships circling around the lower ship came down to meet it. The 2 crafts stayed in this position for several minutes until Tony thought he heard a thump. Instantaneously, more thumps followed, and Tony, using his binoculars, saw that the middle aircraft was dropping what Tony suspected to be newspapers from the inside of its center hole as it swiftly approached his watercraft. When the aircraft got close enough, it was discovered that the objects weren't newspapers but instead white, lightweight metals and black, lava-like rocks. Tony even stated that when the lava-like rocks landed in the sea, it caused the water to steam. With these dangerous pieces of debris falling ever closer to their boat, the crew sought cover below deck. However, not before one of the materials struck Tony's dog, killing it in the process, and another one wounded his son in the arm. Tony even tried to radio for assistance, but the transmitter wasn't functioning. Even though his radio was out of action and no help was on the way, most of the debris splashed into the water. Soon after the raining of metals and rocks, the airships rose up high into the sky and zoomed westward together. The crew then exited the lower deck and examined the boat for any damage. Luckily for the crew, the boat was hardly damaged, and they set sail back to their dock, lowering the dog over the side and into the water in the form of a burial at sea. Upon docking, Tony took his son to the hospital so that his wounds could be treated and afterwards explained the incident to his boss, Mark, who didn't believe Tony. When the photos Tony took of his patrol were printed and examined, the strange airships Tony had informed him of and showed him in the now-developed photos were compared and believed to be film noise and damage caused by radiation. Not wanting to shy away from proving the incident's authenticity, Tony returned to island to collect rock samples in hopes of finding the ones dropped from the middle aircraft that he had encountered during the incident. Tony reported that while he did this, he spotted one of the aircraft hovering above him as if it were spying on him. He eventually gathered the rocks and was preparing to show them to his boss the next day. But when that day came, he was visited by a small, pale man in a black suit. The man suggested that the pair of them should get breakfast together, to which Tony agreed. So, he followed the stranger to a restaurant. While they ate breakfast together, the strange man asked no questions but instead gave a descriptive account about what Tony had witnessed the previous day and eventually warned Tony that bad things would happen not only to him but to his entire family. Men then acknowledged that Tony had been telling the truth. So, the pair of them sent a package to publisher Ray Palmer in Chicago, who later founded Fate magazine. The contents inside the package were the metal fragments and statements about the strange incidents and findings on the 21st and 22nd of June, a noteworthy incident that we continue to discuss and debate amongst ourselves to this day. Yet not even a month later would another incident occur that is possibly the most well-known and talked about alien encounter in history, Roswell. On July 8, 1947, in the small town of Roswell, New Mexico, there were reports of a flying disc that crashed into the desert not far from the Walker Air Base. This made front headlines around the world. The reports noted that bodies of aliens had been retrieved from the crash site and were hauled to the infamous Area 51 Air Base in the Nevada desert, where autopsies were performed and carried out. Shortly afterwards, a press release by high military authorities stated that rumors of a flying saucer had become something of a reality and that an intelligence officer at the Roswell Army Airfield was fortunate enough to gain and hold possession of one of the saucers. This statement sent newspaper reports of the incident around the world insane, and news headlines of this Roswell flying saucer were everywhere. However, just 24 hours later, that high military authority changed their story, stating that they had made a mistake and that the flying saucer was actually, in fact, a weather balloon. Unbelievably, the public appeared to have accepted this explanation, and very little was said about the Roswell incident for many years afterwards. It wasn't until the late 1970s when some military personnel involved began to speak out about what happened all those years ago, and ufologists, as well as conspiracy theorists, went into overdrive, thus developing the Roswell case into the incident as we know it today. One of the first military personnel to speak out about the Roswell UFO incident was Major Jesse Marcel. He was one of the 2 military personnel sent to investigate the crash site. The other one who was with Major Jesse Marcel was Sheridan Cavett, who had always claimed that he wasn't even there. Major Jesse Marcel described how large amounts of metallic debris were scattered all over the area, so the craft had obviously hit the ground at a high speed. He stated that it was clearly not a weather balloon, aircraft, or missile because he recovered fragments from the crash and described seeing hieroglyphic types of writing painted on it. The metal was also reported by him to be light, thin as paper, but incredibly strong and hard, which was unlike anything he had ever seen in his career and life before. He also helped answer the question as to where the fragments were taken by simply saying not only did they have the one he analyzed but others as well, which are being kept well preserved in a military installation somewhere. Marcel's story doesn't end there, however, because later in life he told his expanding family about his investigation at Roswell. According to his grandson, my grandfather Marcel would privately share details of his experiences with the entire family. And when I was a kid, basically around the dinner table, he told us how he was the head of intelligence and lead investigator of the 509 bombing group. He would talk about it with people, continuously asking a multitude of questions about the Roswell UFO incident. The National Security Agency published a report in 1994, a staggering 47 years after the initial incident, which stated that the alien bodies supposedly recovered from the crash site were, in fact, just life-size test dummies. Many saw this as the government just trying to dig itself out and cover up the situation, which only continued to fuel conspiracy theories. Lots more witnesses came forward and spoke out about the Roswell UFO incident, including a photographer who claims that he was asked if he could photograph the crash site. He explained how he was asked to take photos inside a dark-tinted area where he observed 4 identical bodies with humongous heads and shadowy skin. After taking the pictures, he was debriefed and ordered to forget everything he noticed at the crash site. But then a witness more credible than everybody else combined spoke out just before he passed away in 2005. His name was Lieutenant Walter Haut, the man who published and released the original weather balloon report back in 1947. Before his passing, he wrote and left a sworn affidavit in which he claimed that the weather balloon story was a cover-up for the UFO that had been successfully recovered from the crash site. He also confirmed that he had seen dead alien bodies in this still widely debated Roswell UFO incident. With these 2 incidents raising so much speculations and questions, one might ask if we will ever know what went on. However, as the years fly by and as the people who were involved or witnessed these incidents pass away, we are really only drifting further away from the inevitable answer. So until the government sheds light on this mystery or the next incident does that for us, we can only continuously marvel at the fact that these 2 instances combined have been not only the gateway to extraterrestrial debates as we know them today, but also might just be the biggest government cover-ups in history regarding human contact with alien and otherworldly beings. Though these 2 events are the most widely renowned encounters with extraterrestrials, thousands of encounters have been reported throughout the world to the present day. I never told anyone this story because I never thought they would believe me. I was home alone one evening and had gone to sleep for the night. I lived with my significant other and 2 indoor cats, but she was out of state traveling for business. All started with a camping trip. Me and my girlfriend, let's just call her Lee, were young and dumb, blissfully unaware of the cosmic curveball life was about to throw our way. Picture this: crisp mountain air, crackling campfire, the Milky Way sprawled across the velvet darkness. Textbook postcard perfect. Except the postcard ripped in half when we woke up the next morning, disoriented, clothes rumpled, and with a gaping hole in our memories where the previous day should have been. We brushed it off as a weird shared dream, a glitch in the matrix, but a niggling unease settled in our gut, a premonition of things to come. Back in the familiar chaos of college life, things got weirder. Lee, normally the picture of health, started experiencing these unexplainable physical oddities, dizzy spells, nausea, heightened sensitivity to light. Then came the bombshell: pregnant. Impossible. She was on the pill religiously. The doctors were as confused as us, their tests revealing nothing out of the ordinary. Yet, as the weeks ticked by, the strangeness intensified. Lee's body became a battleground, her health fluctuating like a runaway roller coaster. One week she'd be glowing, energetic, the next, pale and listless. The baby inside her, meanwhile, seemed to be defying the laws of biology, growing at an alarming rate. The ultrasound session was disturbing. Before Lee and I knew what we were looking at, the technician ended the session. She seemed disturbed, leaving with no explanations given. Both Lee and I were beyond bewildered, bordering on desperation. My countless calls to the specialist's office only yielded the frustrating response: "The doctor is busy. He will call you back." But that call never came. Determined to uncover the truth hidden in those ultrasound images, I took matters into my own hands, parking myself near his car after his workday. The specialist was visibly shocked to find me there. There was no subtlety in my approach. I practically tried to force an answer from him. His bewildered expression shifted as he hesitated before urging, "Tell your wife to get an abortion." That's all I got from him, nothing more. His profound fear caught my attention. I couldn't fathom why he seemed so terrified about our baby's unusual condition. Then, the arrival of a black van nearby intensified his distress. His eyes fixated on it, and the fear seemed to double. As I left, deliberately passing close to the van, the driver's window lowered. Two men in suits and sunglasses shot me an eerie look. As the doctor drove away, the van started up, following him ominously into the unknown. The fear gnawed at me, a constant unwelcome companion. It was this creeping sense of being watched, a feeling like unseen eyes were tracking our every move. Then came that night in the apartment. We woke up, not to the comforting hum of the fridge or the distant sirens of the city, but to a bone-chilling silence, broken only by the frantic thumping of our hearts. In the inky blackness, a presence loomed, unseen but undeniable, radiating an oppressive dread that seeped into our very bones. I am telling you, that night there was more than us in that apartment. Only the Lord knows what that presence was, but it felt otherworldly. We fled that night, seeking refuge in Lee's parents' house, the unease clinging to us like a second skin. That's when I started getting anxiously suspicious about the gap in our memories from the night out camping in the wild. The pieces started falling into place: the strangeness of that event, the unexplainable pregnancy, the constant feeling of being watched. They all pointed towards something not of this world. The doctor's frantic insistence on more tests, his desperate pleas for termination. What further fueled my suspicion was that the doctor always had excuses not to see us or kept the sessions ridiculously short, never giving any clear answers to any of our questions. To myself, I wondered if it was his way to punish me for the time I creeped up to him in the parking lot, or if he was hiding something from us, possibly both. This wasn't a normal pregnancy. This was something else entirely. God knows what. Lee, bless her heart, refused to listen. Motherhood blazed in her eyes, a fierce determination that trumped logic and fear. She was going to have this baby, no matter what the test said, no matter what dark secret it held. Eventually, I decided it's better to let her live her naive dream. Denial can be bliss. I was hoping that she was right. I was hoping it was merely me being paranoid. If the baby was abnormal, we would have it anyway, if that is what she wanted. The climax arrived like a sucker punch. Lee went into early labor, the doctors acting frantic, their faces etched with worry. Then came those two men in suits, their expressions unreadable, barring my entry to the delivery room like guardians of some forbidden secret. It was like they were hiding something, something terrifying. When they finally let me in, it was over. The baby, they claimed, died during the procedure. We never saw the body. Some fabricated story about a mix-up, an admin error. A wave of relief washed over me, an undeniable sensation despite the crushing grief clawing at my insides, a hollow echoing in my chest. Lee was devastated. It was slow, but time heals all, and she recovered. The years that followed were a haze: marriage, 3 beautiful, normal children, a life built on laughter and love. We tried to build normally and succeeded to a large extent. And that is our story. Yet it does not end there. Sometimes I wish it did. Ignorance would have been a simpler path. Something was off. Both of us shared nightmares, became our unwelcome souvenir. We never spoke of them, but the knowing glances confirmed our mutual torment. Weeks of normalcy could be shattered by a single morning, both of us awakening as if we'd relived that night in the wilderness every time, both of us at the same time. Its synchronized nature was disturbing. These random nightmares could come at any time. It couldn't continue. When our youngest, barely 5, noticed our erratic behavior, his innocent question cut deep: why are mommy and daddy in such a bad mood some mornings? Desperate for answers, we confided in a trusted psychologist. He suspected suppressed joint trauma and referred us to a hypnotherapist and her practice partner. Our separate but simultaneous sessions with the two hypnotherapists uncovered the horror. It all came out, or most of it in any case, or so we believe. Gosh, I think we would have preferred the amnesia. The memories were horrific: the oppressive silence of the woods, the sudden blinding light that filled our tent, the feeling of weightlessness as we were lifted skyward, the colossal metallic craft hovering silently above. Then came the figures themselves, tall and slender with elongated limbs and skin that seemed to shimmer in the otherworldly light, their faces shrouded in shadow, radiating an unsettling calm. Their movements devoid of human emotion, their large almond-shaped black eyes, that is one thing that I can't get out of my mind since the regression sessions. And of course, those creepy six-fingered hands touching everywhere. The details were terrifyingly clear: the sterile examination rooms, the cold metal instruments, the unsettling hums and piercing screams. We were not the only ones. They forced us apart. They controlled our bodies and movement. We were taken to separate rooms where we endured unspeakable experiments. From me, they extracted samples, a primal instinct telling me it wasn't what later transpired with Lee. For her, they did something far, far more monstrous, invasive, and unbelievable, manipulating her body and planting the unwelcome seed of that child. We didn't know their motives, but had to endure their cold touch and emotionless indifference. Emerging from the therapist's office, we clung to each other, trembling, tears mingling with the bitter stain of confirmation. Those fragmented memories finally coalesced into a horrifying whole, confirming our darkest suspicions. We weren't just abducted, we were subjects in some experiment, unwilling pawns in their grand design. Regular therapy sessions became our battleground, where we wrestled with the horrific memories and lingering trauma. Despite the semblance of normalcy we rebuilt, the shadows of our experience clung to the corners, whispers of what if clinging to the air. But the heaviest shadow loomed large: the baby, the one we lost. The burden became unbearable, a weight threatening to crush us both. I embarked on a mission for answers, tracking down the retired doctor across state lines in a Sarasota restaurant. Years etched on his face mirrored our own. He unveiled the truth: the six-digit codes on tiny limbs, the oversized head, the huge black eyes like bottomless voids. Each unsettling detail chipped away at our hope, while the revelation of its survival, spirited away by shadowy figures claiming government affiliation, plunged us into a new abyss of fear and confusion. There's more to the story, secrets too unsettling to share in the open, but one even if the answers lead us deeper into the darkness. I once worked as a direct care aide for a 65-year-old woman with a developmental disability. Her daughter, who was in her 40s, worked overnights, and she needed a caretaker with medical experience to watch her overnight. When I say I once worked for them, I mean I literally worked once, just this night. And you're about to hear why I never went back. The 65-year-old woman's name was Giselle. Her daughter's name, who contacted me, was Evelyn. It's possible Evelyn didn't have any other family to watch her and didn't want to or couldn't afford to put Giselle in a nursing home. Or it was possible that she felt more comfortable hiring somebody with some form of experience to watch over her. At the time, I was already a direct care worker for two other women who suffered from some forms of developmental disabilities, so I had experience, but nothing prepared me for that night. Evelyn left for work earlier that day. I worked my first job, so I was really pushing my body to exhaustion, trying to make as much money as possible. Evelyn had introduced Giselle and me. Giselle had given me a smile before Evelyn brought her upstairs to her bedroom for the night. It was around 9 p.m. Evelyn told me that Giselle would sometimes walk around the house at night, acting confused, and I'd need to calm her down and bring her back to her room. She specifically addressed this not to be a form of sleepwalking. When I asked, she said it's one of the symptoms of her mother's dementia. I told her to rest assured that I'd know how to handle it. I spent my time initially in the living room, catching up on my show, These jobs aren't super glamorous, and for the most part, it is a lot of sitting around. I heard footsteps from upstairs. I went to the stairway and looked up the stairs, then called Giselle's name, asking if she needed anything. She didn't answer. I heard her footsteps go back to her room, and then the door closed. Maybe she went to the bathroom. I went back to the living room and watched some more TV. It was maybe an hour later that I got up to grab my sandwich that I brought from the fridge. As I left the kitchen with a plate and my sandwich to go back to the couch, I nearly had a heart attack and dropped the plate when I saw Giselle standing at the doorway, glass shattered everywhere. I apologized to her and asked if she was okay. She started yelling at me, "Who are you?" I reminded her who I am, that I'm her direct care worker here to make sure she's okay. Everything she said at this point was in a loud scream, "Why are you here? I don't know you." Things of that nature. I reminded her that we had just met and that her daughter Evelyn hired me to watch her and the house. This seemed to work for long enough for me to get her to come back upstairs with me and to her room. I brought her up a glass of water and some melatonin. I made sure she took both before going back downstairs. After a few hours, I was absolutely exhausted. I had to get a couple of hours of shut-eye. There was a spare bedroom upstairs with a twin-sized bed where Evelyn said I could rest if needed. I felt like at this point, Giselle was asleep for the night from the melatonin. I fell asleep within minutes, but I was asleep for only maybe an hour. I woke up to a sound from downstairs. It was this repeated slamming every 1 to 2 seconds. Something from downstairs was being slammed. I jumped out of the bed. I had left the bedroom door open so that I'd hear anything if Giselle got up, case in point, right here. When I got to the stairs, I realized the slamming was coming from the kitchen. I walked down the stairs as quickly as I could while still remaining quiet. Getting to the bottom, I peered around the opening to the kitchen, and what I saw was like a scene from a scary movie I had seen before. I saw Giselle in the darkness, standing in front of the oven, repeatedly opening it and slamming it shut. It was horrifying. When I say I saw Giselle, I really only saw her silhouette. It was that dark in the kitchen. I said, "Giselle," really loudly. She stopped, turned to her left at me, shut the oven door one final time, and started walking towards me, towards the stairs. I said in a now softer, kind of scared-sounding voice, "Are you okay?" She got close enough to me where I could now see her facial features, and she looked at me with this blank expression, then walked right past me and started walking up the stairs. I followed her upstairs, but as soon as she got to her room, she slammed her door shut. I knocked on the door, saying, "Giselle, are you all right?" She didn't respond. I quietly opened the door just to peek inside, and I saw Giselle at the side of her bed, just standing facing the wall. I've seen a lot, but this was some pretty unsettling behavior that I feel like is the exact kind of stuff you'd see in some scary movies, like I mentioned before. I walked over to her and gently eased her into the bed. When she was lying down, I covered her, and for what I was hoping would be the final time, I said, "Good night, Giselle," and shut her door. I went across the upstairs to the spare room and went back to bed. I purposely tried not to fall asleep for at least half an hour, just in case she'd wake up again, but I don't even know if I made it that long. All I know is I fell asleep pretty freaking quickly. I woke up once again, however, much later. The room was still pitch black, and the 1-hour alarm I set had not yet gone off. I looked around the room, wondering what woke me up. I didn't see what it was until I heard a sound from inside the closet. I then noticed the cracked open closet door and the black shadow of a head peeking out of the closet. Again, I almost had a heart attack. I said, "Giselle." She didn't answer. I kept saying, "Giselle," a bunch of times until she pushed the door open, and I saw her approaching the bed slowly. She started saying what she was saying hours ago again, "Who are you? I don't know you." As she got closer, I tried calming her down, reminding her who I am. I reached for the lamp next to the bed and fumbled with it until it turned on. Giselle was holding a huge kitchen knife in her hand. At this moment, everything changed. Giselle was now a threat to my life, and I had to worry about myself, not her. I screamed at this point. Giselle, put the knife down. I guess my scream stressed her out because she got closer and started screaming back at me, still repeating, "I don't know you." I wasn't going to attempt to calm down a knife-wielding dementia patient. That was not in any job description. I mapped out a way to run around her in the bedroom, and I went for it. I jumped off the bed on the side further from her, and she screamed again, "Who are you?" She swung the knife at the air as I ran past her. It was a slow and weak swipe from what I saw, but nonetheless, it showed that she had intentions of actually using it. I got downstairs, grabbed my shoes, and went outside. Instead of calling 911, I called Evelyn as she requested I do if there was an issue. I was courteous in doing this because getting law enforcement involved is never doing anyone any favors. Evelyn was yelling into the phone at me not to leave her. Honestly, I yelled back that she attempted to kill me and that I didn't call the police. She had to leave work. Of course, I stayed outside of the house, making sure Giselle didn't go anywhere until Evelyn returned. When Evelyn went inside, Giselle was back in her bed, asleep. Evelyn went as far as accusing me of exaggerating the whole thing until she found the knife next to Giselle's bed. To not give her any more fuel to blame me for any of this, I left out the fact that I ever went to sleep. But that doesn't mean that I felt in any way I did anything wrong. Evelyn even offered me that room to sleep. I never worked in that house again. Giselle was a scarier patient than I'd ever dealt with in any of my jobs in my 9 years of being a direct care aide. The call came in around noon. Nothing out of the ordinary, just a disturbance at an old house on the edge of town. My first day on the force and I was itching to prove myself. The dispatcher said it sounded like a simple domestic dispute, some old man screaming at his neighbors maybe. They gave me the address and I was off. The house was a relic from another era, sagging under the weight of neglect. The yard was a jungle of overgrown weeds and the porch sagged like a broken limb. As I approached, I noticed the windows were grimy, obscured by years of dirt and dust, making it impossible to see inside. I knocked on the door, the sound echoing through the stillness. "Police, anyone home?" I called out. No response. I knocked again, louder this time, and the door creaked open, revealing a dark hallway cluttered with old furniture and stacks of newspapers. "Hello, police." "Police officer, I'm here to help," I announced, stepping inside. The air was thick with the stench of rot and decay. My hand instinctively moved to the grip of my gun as I ventured further. I heard a faint, almost imperceptible shuffling noise coming from the back of the house. "Sir, ma'am, I'm coming in," I said, my voice steady. The shuffling grew louder, accompanied by the unmistakable sound of something being dragged across the floor. I rounded a corner into the kitchen, and the sight that met my eyes stopped me cold. An elderly man was lying on the floor, his body contorted in a way that no living person could manage. His eyes were wide open, staring blankly at the ceiling, and his mouth was twisted in a silent scream. "Jesus," I muttered, rushing to his side. I checked for a pulse but found none. That's when I noticed the blood, a thick dark pool spreading out from under him. I called it in, requesting backup and an ambulance, though I knew it was too late for the latter. As I waited, I decided to check the rest of the house. The shuffling noise continued, growing more distinct and closer. I followed the sound to a door at the end of the hallway. It was slightly ajar, and as I pushed it open, I was hit with a wave of putrid air. The room was dimly lit, the only source of light being a small grimy window. In the center of the room was a large wooden wardrobe. The shuffling was coming from inside. I approached cautiously, my heart pounding in my chest. With one swift motion, I flung the wardrobe doors open and there, amidst a pile of old clothes and junk, was a young woman, her eyes wild with terror. "Please don't hurt me," she whimpered, recoiling from the light. "It's okay," I said softly, reaching out a hand. "I'm here to help." "What's your name?" "Hillary," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Hillary, can you tell me what happened here?" She shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "He kept us here, wouldn't let us leave." "Who did?" I asked, but she just kept shaking her head, her eyes darting around the room as if expecting him to return at any moment. I helped her out of the wardrobe and guided her towards the front of the house. "Stay here," I said. "Backup is on the way." As I turned to go back inside, she grabbed my arm. "Wait, there's more in the basement." "The basement?" I hadn't even noticed a door to a basement. "Okay, stay put," I said, trying to reassure her. I headed back inside, my senses on high alert. It took me a few minutes, but I finally found the basement door hidden behind a stack of old boxes. The door was heavy, made of thick wood, and it creaked loudly as I pushed it open. The air that wafted up from below was dank and cold, sending a shiver down my spine. I descended the stairs slowly, my flashlight cutting through the darkness. The basement was vast, lined with old shelves and more piles of junk. But in the far corner, I saw something that made my blood run cold, a series of cages, each containing a person. They were emaciated, their eyes hollow and lifeless. Some were unconscious, others moaned softly. I rushed over, my mind racing. "It's okay," I said, trying to sound calm. "I'm here to get you out." As I worked to open the cages, I heard a noise behind me. I turned to see a man standing at the top of the stairs, silhouetted against the light. He was holding something in his hand, something long and sharp. "Who are you?" he demanded, his voice a low growl. "Police," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Put the weapon down." He didn't move. Instead, he started down the stairs, his eyes locked on mine. "You shouldn't be here," he said. "Put it down," I commanded, drawing my gun. He paused, his eyes flickering with something like recognition. Then, with a snarl, he lunged at me. The next few moments were a blur of motion and noise. I fired, the shot echoing through the basement. The man fell, the knife clattering to the floor. I stood there, breathing heavily, my hands shaking. The adrenaline was still pumping through my veins, but I knew I had to keep it together. I finished freeing the captives, and soon the house was swarming with police and paramedics. As they carried the survivors out, one of the detectives approached me. "Hell of a first day, huh?" "Yeah," I said, my voice hollow. Hell of a first day. In the days that followed, the details of the case came to light. The old man had been a recluse, his descent into madness hidden from the world. He had kept his victims trapped in the basement for years, feeding off their fear and suffering. Hillary, it turned out, had been his first victim. She had been reported missing over a decade ago, and her family had long since given up hope of finding her. She was the one who had managed to escape her cage and find a way to call for help. That first day on the job changed everything. I had wanted to prove myself, and I did, but at what cost? The horrors I had witnessed would stay with me forever, a constant reminder of the darkness that lurked just beneath the surface of everyday life. My first day as a plumber started like any other. A call came in from an older woman in a creaky old house on the edge of town, reporting severe leaks in her kitchen. I was eager to make a good impression and maybe score a repeat customer. I had no idea what I was in for. When I arrived, the house was shrouded in an unsettling stillness. The lady, Mrs. Beatrix, was a frail, wary woman with sharp eyes that seemed to pierce right through me. She led me back in 2004. I was a broke teenager, so my mom made me get a job at our local McDonald's. It was nothing special. It was my very first day working at McDonald's. I was so nervous but excited to start my new job. I got the breakfast shift and had to be there to start prepping at 5 a.m. I hardly slept the night before, anxious about making a good impression. I arrived early, introduced myself to the manager, Callista, and she got me set up. I spent the first hour or so watching training videos and filling out paperwork. Callista said I was picking things up quickly and could start helping out up front. Around 7:30 a.m., things started to pick up as we got into the core breakfast rush. I was working the register, taking orders and collecting payments. We had a full restaurant, people eating, people waiting in line. I recognized a few regulars Callista pointed out. About a half hour into my register duty, the front door chimed as a customer walked in. He was a white man, probably early 40s, average height and build, wearing jeans, boots, and a plain black windbreaker. He quietly got into line, keeping his head down. When he got to me, he ordered a sausage McMuffin meal to go and handed me a $10 bill. As I opened the cash drawer to make change, he suddenly pulled out a gun from his coat pocket. I froze in terror and shock. This couldn't be happening, I thought. The man shouted violently for everyone to get down and shut up or he would start shooting. A woman nearby let out a scream, which agitated the man. In a flash, he rapidly fired the gun at her, and the bullet hit her directly in the chest. She collapsed to the floor, the whole scene unfolding in mere seconds. The robber grabbed me by the shirt over the counter and put the hot barrel firmly into my cheek. His eyes were bulging and frenetic, like he was on heavy drugs. He told me to empty the cash register drawer immediately into a bag he threw at me. My hands were quivering so badly I could hardly grasp the money. Meanwhile, the rest of the lobby had erupted into pandemonium, with some people running for the door and others ducking behind tables. Just then, the manager, Callista, came rushing out from the back area. She saw the woman bleeding out on the tiled floor, then the robber pressing the gun to my face. I could see Callista assessing the situation, hesitating for a moment on what to do next. In that pause, the crazed robber suddenly withdrew from me and fired 2 consecutive shots directly at Callista. A piercing temporary deafness filled my ears. Callista's body hit the floor with a sick thud. I looked at the gory wound in her chest in utter disbelief, expecting she might gasp for air or show any splinter of life, but she was already gone. An eerie silence fell over the restaurant. The reality and trauma finally set in for me. I became lightheaded and could feel myself nearly passing out. Through the fog, I could hear police sirens approaching outside. The robber grabbed the bag of cash from the counter where I had dropped it. On his way out, he fired the gun erratically behind him towards anyone standing nearby. I later learned one of those final bullets killed a man who had been waiting quietly for his breakfast order when the madness broke out. The survivor guilt crushed me for weeks, thinking if I had gotten the robber what he wanted faster, that man might be alive. But the trauma counselors told me that was misplaced blame. In the end, 3 people were dead, and I was left emotionally scarred from the events of my first day. The robber was caught the next day trying to skip town. Every time I pass a McDonald's now, everything comes flooding back as if it just happened yesterday. Into the kitchen where water was steadily pooling under the sink, spreading out across the faded linoleum. "Thank you for coming so quickly," she said in a voice that quivered like dry leaves. "It's been like this for days. I've had trouble getting someone out here." I nodded and got to work, sliding under the sink with my flashlight in hand. The smell hit me first, something foul and putrid, far worse than just mold or mildew. The pipes were ancient, corroded, and clearly the source of the leak. As I began to dismantle them, a thick, dark sludge oozed out, filling the air with a nauseating stench. "Looks like you've got some serious blockage here, Mrs. Beatrix," I called out, trying to keep the disgust out of my voice. She didn't respond. When I glanced over my shoulder, she was standing in the doorway, watching me with those unnervingly sharp eyes. I turned back to the pipes, focusing on clearing the obstruction. As I pulled out handfuls of the thick muck, I noticed something odd. Among the sludge were small bones, animal bones, I thought at first, but then I saw what looked like tiny, human-like fingers, complete with nails. A chill ran down my spine, but I kept working, trying to rationalize what I was seeing. Maybe a rat had gotten stuck in the pipes and decomposed, but the fingers, they were too perfect, too intact. As I probed deeper, my flashlight flickered and then went out, plunging me into darkness. The silence was oppressive, and the smell seemed to grow stronger, almost as if it were pressing down on me. "Mrs. Beatrix," I said, my voice sounding strange and hollow in the confined space. "Do you have another flashlight?" No response. I scrambled out from under the sink, my hands covered in the vile sludge, and found the kitchen empty. Mrs. Beatrix was gone. I fumbled for my phone, using its weak light to navigate the dim room. That's when I saw it, a small wooden door in the corner of the kitchen, slightly ajar, revealing a narrow staircase leading down into the basement. Curiosity and dread battled within me, but the plumber in me needed to know where the pipes led. I pushed open the door and descended the stairs, each creak of the wood echoing ominously. The basement was cold, damp, and filled with the same overpowering stench. My phone's light swept across the room, revealing a scene that made my blood run cold. There were jars, dozens of them, lined up on shelves, filled with murky liquid and what looked like more of those tiny bones. In the center of the room was an old, rusted tub connected to the pipes that ran up into the kitchen. Inside the tub was the source of the blockage, a grotesque, half-decomposed figure, its limbs twisted unnaturally and its face frozen in a grimace of pain. The fingers, they matched the ones I'd found in the pipes. Panic gripped me, and I stumbled back, knocking over one of the jars. It shattered, spilling its foul contents across the floor. I turned to flee, but there, at the top of the stairs, stood Mrs. Beatrix. Her eyes glinted in the dim light, and a twisted smile played on her lips. "You weren't supposed to see this," she said softly, almost kindly. "But now that you have." I didn't wait to hear the rest. I bolted past her, adrenaline fueling my sprint through the house and out the door. I didn't stop until I was safely back in my van, my heart pounding and my mind racing. I reported what I'd seen to the authorities, but when they arrived, the house was empty. The jar, the body in the tub, everything was gone. Mrs. Beatrix had vanished without a trace. That was my first and last day as a plumber. The memory of those tiny fingers in the pipe still haunts me, and I can't shake the feeling that Mrs. Beatrix is still out there, watching, waiting for the next unsuspecting soul to stumble into her web. I haven't told my story to many people except for my wife and a few other of my close friends. It happened while I was stationed in the Army as a radio operator during the Vietnam War, and I haven't forgotten it to this day. I was a young recruit, freshly drafted out of high school, and I didn't know much about the war. I had no idea what I was getting into or what it was all for, but what I did know was that I had a duty to my fellow servicemen. We arrived on a Friday evening and got loaded onto many buses to be taken to our barracks. The air was very humid, and the soil was soaking wet due to a storm that had just passed through the area. I vividly remember the drive and how it stunk like sewer. My first night was uneventful and quiet, but we all felt the tense atmosphere as our drill sergeants taunted us with stories during BAS training. I remember the half-moon right over my head, which kept peeking out from over the clouds, and all of us were just sitting around telling jokes. I was more of a technical guy and didn't have much aptitude for comedy, so I just listened in. My duty was to manage communications between my unit and all of our other guys so that everyone knew what was going on everywhere else. I carried a box on my back, which were the size of radio devices back then, and also a ton more equipment and supplies. I was quickly assigned to a tight-knit unit who had just lost their communications operator to a landmine, and I remember the first time we made contact with the enemy. It was the loudest thing I ever heard. We were in a dense part of the jungle and couldn't see the enemy at all, but we quickly ducked as soon as they began firing at us, and we opened fire in their general direction in return. The chaos seemed to last forever, and we probably ceased fire after a couple of minutes. We advanced forward to close in on the enemy and secure the area, and it was the first time I ever saw the enemy up close. There they were, 3 dead Viet Cong soldiers laying in a pool of their own blood. I couldn't believe that I was looking at 3 human beings that were alive just moments ago, young guys who maybe had sisters or brothers and parents. They were probably just chilling around moments before we arrived, and here we are moments later looking at their motionless bodies. But I must say that I felt justified because they were the enemy, and they would have been standing over our dead bodies instead. A few days later, we got assigned to a different location which saw heavier casualties and needed more support. I grew accustomed to the violence and saw many of our young men die painfully. One day, I was told by my NCO that someone wanted to speak with me. I was greeted by an older man in his late 50s who looked totally out of place. His demeanor was calculated and predictive, and even my commanding officer seemed to have turned into a yes man in front of him. He introduced himself as RCK Henry, an intelligence officer stationed nearby, and said that I was going to be assigned to him as an RTO for his unit. I liked my unit and wanted to stay with them, but orders are orders, and I had no choice. So I got on the Huey and went with him. We landed in a heavily wooded area next to a few Viet Cong huts. It was heavily built up by the enemy, and I could definitely imagine the fight that must have taken place here. There were some guys who had gas masks on and others standing nearby, but they didn't seem to notice me or even care that I was there. It was a very strange atmosphere that didn't feel quite right. These guys didn't act like normal soldiers and definitely didn't have the look of fear in their eyes as most of us did. I even tried to talk with some of them, but all I got was a strange, emotionless glare like they were infected with something. Whatever it was, they all had it, and it made me feel very uneasy. Officer Henry and I entered one of the smaller huts, and I was told to stay put until someone would come and get me. I should have just stayed there and waited, but I was too curious and apprehensive to relax, so I made my way out towards the main tent and took a peek inside. What I saw made my stomach drop like it never had before. On a makeshift table lay 6 murky containers. Each one of them had a severed head of a guerrilla fighter inside, with several tubes and wires protruding from them. A green liquid seemed to be reacting with the heads as their mouths and eyes were quivering like they were half alive. I suddenly felt a hand grab onto my shoulder. It was Intelligence Officer Henry, and he looked very upset. I meekly asked what they were doing inside there, but he angrily said that I should not have gone in there and sent me back to my hut. We must have been attacked or something because I woke up a day later in triage with several broken ribs and a fractured collarbone with no memory of anything that happened right after that. I never saw Officer Frederick Henry or those soldiers ever again during my time, if that was even his real name, and I often wonder what those guys were doing back there. Maybe they were trying to gather intelligence from dead enemy soldiers or something. Either way, it was a strange experience that I'll never forget. That was near the end of my first tour of Iraq, from November 2006 to August 2007. It was July. We were RVing with Iraqi police, with the majority of our platoon sitting idle in the surrounding area on our M1151S. In the distance, we heard a few shots of small arms fire, which our second lieutenant wanted to investigate. I was the driver to the second squad leader in Spartan 2, and we generally took the lead with us. Our platoon, which was undermanned with 2 squads instead of 3 or 4, rolled out with 2 additional Iraqi army trucks and 2 Iraqi police trucks towards the suspicious gunfire outside the main village. There was a cluster of buildings, like a mini village, with one dirt and gravel road about half a mile long, with a drainage ditch on the left and a canal on the right. This is where leadership failed on a few counts. First, air drone recon was called and responding, yet we did not wait for recon to proceed. Second, dirt and gravel roads are avoided as much as possible because of the ease with which IEDs can be placed and hidden. Third, a secondary road was located but had clearly been intentionally blocked, making the main road suspicious and even more dangerous. Lastly, upon proceeding down the road, the Iraqi police escort claimed that we were going into an al-Qaeda stronghold and promptly abandoned the convoy, which was ultimately ignored by the 2LT. An Iraqi army Humvee took point next to my truck, and another Iraqi truck with the remaining 7 U.S. trucks proceeded down this road. Roughly halfway down, the lead truck stopped for some reason without radio contact. We had no idea why until I moved to the side a bit and saw a ditch across the road blocking safe passage forward. My squad leader got out to get some word with the Iraqis ahead and immediately jumped back in his seat. At that same moment, we came under small arms fire. He jumped back in, yelling about being shot at. Outside my driver's window, I saw 3 men pop up from tall grass about 50 meters directly beside my truck, firing AKs. My gunner called out a bongo truck to the frontier of the village with a mounted dushka, which is like a huge Russian version of a .50 cal. This was a typical L-shaped ambush, and I was front and center. No way forward, left, right, nor hasty retreat. Taking small arms and now heavy machine gun fire, my gunner engaged the bongo truck, and I could see the M240 turret kicking up dust around the 3 engaged on my left. I just sat there, unable to defend myself. Then came a bang, a flash of fire and smoke. I thought it was an IED. I felt a pinch on my left cheek and touched it, drawing back a heavily bloody glove. I slapped it back on and applied pressure, training kicking in immediately. I called out to the squad leader, "I'm bleeding," while I wondered if I was dying since I felt no pain. Unbeknownst to me, the time the fire suppression system had activated, the heavy gas made her voice sound super low, like the opposite of helium. It was like a movie betrayal in slow motion, and my senses were all messed up. I had enough of sitting there in the kill zone and started to reverse. The Iraqi truck behind me didn't get the hint until I rammed him about 2 or 3 times. Finally, we began to back slowly away, which isn't easy on a narrow road with one hand on the wheel, with only a single side mirror. No backup mirror, and the passenger side mirror was blocked from view. At some point, the medic had run up to my truck from about 3 back to jump in mine under fire. We managed to move the convoy far back enough that my squad leader could drive and the medic could tend to me. We eventually moved off the road and headed back to base while I sent up my own 9-line media on the Blue Force tracker. After being seen by medics and being flown by Blackhawk to Ballot Medical, I learned that I wasn't hit by an IED. The dushka had penetrated the armor of my truck above the windshield, ricocheting off the roll bar beside my head and finally breaking apart, spraying shrapnel across my face. A few inches and I could have had a stump where my head was. The PTSD is an SOB still to this day, and the VA says I'll most likely never be free of it. This particular story took place when I was in the Air Force and stationed in Louisiana. This story took place a few years after I had been stationed there. I first arrived at this base in 2005, and upon my arrival, I, along with many other new troops, were greeted with many different stories of horror. There were stories about a man in a top hat who walked a dark, long, and narrow dirt road on the outskirts of a storage facility area. There was another story about a crazy man who was hit by a patrol car and ran off into the woods next to the same place. But my story relates to a separate story that was told to me. It was my second night on shift, as I recall. I was posted with an airman who had been there for several years. He gave a rundown about some little girl who had been visiting her father when the storage area we were working in was being constructed, which was well before any of our time. The story went that the little girl was playing on some of the structures while her father was working but had fallen to her death by slipping off the edge at the top of the structure itself. Most of the story didn't make sense to me at the time, but regardless of the facts, it still scared the out of me. To make matters worse, the airman had taken me to the exact place where the supposed story took place. He would shut off the engine and turn off the music as we just sat there in silence. He startled me a few times, but nothing ever happened. Now skip forward about 3 years. I was scheduled to work that particular spot of the base this night. Keep in mind that I'd been visiting this spot for years now, but at this point, the storage area had been completely closed down except for a few minor areas, which required us to do physical drive-thrus and checks of this area. The shift itself started out rather shitty. Me and my Steven partner had been given a cattle truck to do this patrol, as our normal vehicle was in the shop for maintenance. Yeah, I'm not kidding, but cattle truck. I know this part doesn't seem very important to the story at the moment, but it will tie into the story eventually. So to save on time, let's skip forward a few hours. We were scheduled to do 3 random checks of the storage facility that night, and we had already completed 2 of the 3 prior without any issues. So, come about 4 o'clock in the morning, we decided to do our last check. Seeing as all the main maintenance guys had gone home for the night in this area, the only way to access the area was with 2 very large separate gates, which took forever to open. We piled in, locked the gates behind us, and continued on our way. Steven was driving during this check, and I was the spotter who used the flashlight to check the lock on each structure. An important detail that I left out, which may be necessary here, is that the story of the little girl had taken place on a road within the storage area, which we called Echo Street. By this point, everything was fine, and we had finished our rounds. Steven made the final turn down Echo Street. We had both been pretty talkative during most of the night, and we were just shooting when I got an uneasy feeling. Something felt different, but I couldn't make out what it was. We were about halfway down the road when things became almost completely and frighteningly silent. Even the rumble of our cattle truck and the faint noise of the radio playing seemed to become less audible as we approached the structure from my previous story. And I must stress at this point that even telling or typing this part still brings a chill down my spine and makes my eyes tear up in fear. But as we approached the structure itself, I turned my head to the outside of the window opposite the structure, and out of my left ear, I heard a sound that nearly caused me to piss myself. It was the sound of a person groaning or moaning in distress, sort of like the moan of the girl from The Grudge. Yes, I'm very serious. The faint, creepy moan began to ring inside the cab of the truck between the 2 of us, in between the dark emptiness of the middle seat. I felt my blood turn cold, and I quickly turned to Steven and yelled, "Dude, cut that out." Steven turned to me with a confused look on his face. At this point, he began to take his foot off the accelerator and asked, "Am I going too fast?" I remained silent for a moment, with my hand in a pausing gesture, and I listened. I heard the noise again. My partner interrupted and asked, "What's wrong?" I quickly turned the music off without saying anything at first, and then I whispered to him, "Do you hear that?" He stopped the truck in confusion and listened closely. It was almost dead silent for a second or 2 when we both heard at this time that long, chilling groan of a woman. It echoed in my ears. It sounded like someone was struggling to breathe and taking in a giant breath of air while someone was trying to strangle them. The sound was beyond terrifying, and the fact that I wasn't the only one hearing it only made it more of a horrifying experience. I found myself beginning to ask him my original question again, but he quickly interrupted and said with a strong sound of fear in his voice, "What the is that?" We stupidly waited to see if we could hear it again. The rumble of the gates on the back of the truck was easily heard and recognized as they made a sort of metal-on-metal clatter, and the diesel engine had that typical rumble as well. But in between both the noises, we heard it again for the final time, that groan. It sounded even louder, but this time it sounded like it was coming from both inside and outside of the truck, like we were being surrounded by whatever was making that noise of distress. Without even making a peep, Steven put the truck in drive, and he hauled our asses off that street quicker than I have ever gone on any other street, and that entire base veered us off the road to speed back. He nearly flipped the truck going around a curve, but it didn't bother us one bit. We were both in an unspoken agreement that we wanted to get out of there quickly. We got to the 2 gates again, and I hopped out of the truck as fast as I could. Steven watched my back as I quickly opened both gates. He jumped back into the driver's seat, sped out, and waited for me to close both gates as well. Once we completed that task, we quickly returned to the main part of the base, and we requested to meet with our flight chief to tell him what had happened. When we finally met up with him, we expected him to think that we were both full of it or that we had just imagined the entire thing, being as it was so late into our 12-hour shift and we were both tired. But I clearly remember him saying to both of us, "I completely believe you." As a matter of fact, I had something like that happen to me twice, once in that same place and the other in that building behind you, as he pointed at our jailhouse. Again, I know that sounds completely cliché with that grudge-like moan we had heard, but it honestly happened, and it still brings those tears of fright into my eyes every time I tell it. I went back to that storage area only once after that, but I never went down that road again, and I never went after dark. During my days as a Marine, I had many different jobs on site, but my least favorite was graveyard patrol. At one point, I was one of the few with the overnight graveyard patrol shift for a nearby memorial cemetery. As you would imagine, it was a pretty slow shift with not much going on. Oddly enough, even though the cemetery was in a remote location surrounded by dense forest on each side, and I was working the literal graveyard shift, I found the job more relaxing than scary or unnerving. I would be the only one in the cemetery. My relief would come around 5 a.m., which would be the end of my shift. So this had to have happened past 3 a.m. Near the end of my shift, it was the end of my shift. It was on this otherwise regular night that I was patrolling near the perimeter fence where some of the older headstones were. I wasn't allowed to be on my phone. If I were to be caught with my phone, I would be reprimanded, even though it was unlikely to be caught since there was no one else really around except for me. I tried my best to follow that rule, so it was just a lot of walking around and looking at old headstones. But anyway, while patrolling past some of the older ones, I began to hear a woman's humming. It was this very calming, soothing kind of humming, and I wasn't calmed or soothed because nobody was supposed to be in the cemetery. So it was more so a cause for concern. I started following the sounds of the humming. It was coming from behind this intentionally planted line of thick trees with vines and brushes sprouting from the sides of them. Instead of walking around the long wall of trees, I squeezed through the vines and bushes to the other side, cutting myself in the process. As I struggled to make it to the other side, the humming suddenly stopped as quickly as it started. I was left alone to the silence once again, not even the sound of a cricket. I walked closer to the edge of the memorial property by the woods near a few of the big mausoleum-looking structures, and I could distinctly hear some kind of buzzing sound coming from one of them. I stepped up the 3 white steps into the structure. The little door didn't have any kind of locks on it. I'd never been in any of these structures until this point, and I was incorrect in my assumption that they were mausoleums. I still don't know what the purpose of them was, maybe some kind of memorial building for deceased veterans in the cemetery. As I was inside that cold, dark structure, I could actually feel the hairs on my arms begin to stand up as I got goosebumps for reasons I wasn't sure of just yet. That buzzing sound was coming from inside of the structure, but it almost seemed like it was coming from beneath my feet. I looked down to the wood floor, and there were tiny round holes in each plank of wood. They seemed big enough to look through but way too dark down there to see what lay below the floorboards. I had an idea. I positioned my phone on the floorboard just right so that the flashlight would shoot light into the hole in the wood, and I would look through one of the other holes. I lay basically flat on the floor with my head pressed up to the wood, one eye closed. I expected to see nothing at all, but I saw what appeared to be the top of a woman's head. And as if she knew I started looking immediately, she looked up at me through the hole. I only saw her face for maybe half a second before I fell backwards and let out a blood-curdling scream. I sprinted back to the parking lot and called the guy who was supposed to relieve me soon and told him to meet me now. When he showed up, I tried to convince him that I was telling the truth about what I'd seen in that little building. He entertained me by coming with me to it, and I repeated what I did earlier with my phone flashlight. He looked through multiple holes but saw nothing. I had to check for myself, and he was right. It was just some small, empty-looking space underneath the structure. I spent the rest of the shift with him. I left at 4 on the dot. I know he didn't believe me. I wouldn't have believed me either. I'm sure it's a possibility that it was a hallucination as a result of my lack of sleep, but I also believe it's a possibility that I witnessed a spirit or something completely supernatural. I'd heard so many older Marines and veterans tell of supernatural experiences they had while serving. I don't know who the woman that I saw could have been if it truly wasn't my imagination, but it chills me to the bone to imagine it having been one of the women buried in the cemetery. I work in the pro department of a home improvement company. I worked the closing shift with another cashier, who I'll call Aria. Aria's a really kind but quite timid cashier. She's also very pretty, so she has a lot of contractors hit on her. It's usually not that worrisome, though a few compliments, maybe a dinner invite, which she politely decline. I would probably ask her out as well if it wasn't for one detail: Aria does have a girlfriend. So being hit on by guys on a daily basis makes her rather uncomfortable. When we first met, I told her she ought to tell those guys about being gay, but she kept saying it wasn't any of their business, so she kept that part to herself. Aria has become my best friend, and having another cashier there with you keeps things from getting lonely. We even cover for each other's lunch breaks. One day, when I came back from lunch, Aria started telling me about this rather creepy guy who was flirting with her. She said she politely turned him down, saying she was with someone already, and while he didn't seem happy, he did leave. I shrugged it off as nothing more than the usual horny guy and laughed it off. But later that day, the man came back. Aria wasn't there, as she had left to help a customer find some lumber, so it was just me. He looked rather normal, probably handsome to most women, but he acted off. After looking around the area, I asked him if I could help him with anything. "I'm here to see Aria," he told me. I asked him how he knew her, and he said he had come in earlier and asked her out, to which she said yes, so he had come back in to pick her up. I told him she had left for the day, a usual lie everyone tells to cover for their friends. His smile went away as he started looking annoyed. He said he wanted to speak to Aria and ask her out again, which contradicted what he had just told me about accepting his previous invite. I told him he could not do that, which caused him to cross his arms and asked me why not. I'm not the best liar when it comes to making up excuses on the spot. However, I didn't want to tell him Aria was gay if she didn't want him to know it. So I just blurted out that Aria was my fiancée. His annoyed look went to confusion as he asked me how someone as pretty as she is could go out with someone like me. I'm not a Chris Evans or anything, but I don't think I'm that bad looking. I told him it didn't matter and that she and I were getting married in a couple of months, so he needed to back off. He gave me a death look but didn't say anything. After an awkward silence, he left. After Aria had gotten back, I told her what went down. She asked me to describe him, and after I told her what he looked like, she said that was the same guy who came in before. She was a bit creeped out by what went down but found the fiancé excuse rather funny. She even stated she'd rather be engaged to me than go out with him, which I'm guessing was a compliment. A couple of weeks went by, and we had all but forgotten about the man. At this point, one night after it had gotten dark, Aria and I were getting the trash together so we could close down the registers and go home. Just then, we heard a bang at the door, causing both of us to nearly jump out of our skins. It was the guy again. He had a wild look in his eyes as he kept his face pressed against the glass. "We're closed," I told him, but he insisted he needed to come in. Aria yelled again to tell him she's not interested and for him to go away and leave her alone. But he yelled that he's not here for her, he's here for me. He then says that if he can take out her husband, then she be all his. Based on that, he wanted to kill me. I told Arya to run to the manager's office and call the police, and I'd stay here and watch him. I won't lie though, I was pretty afraid to be in that tiny little area. If the guy was able to get in, he wasn't the biggest guy, but he could have had a weapon on him. Plus, the store doesn't allow us to have self-defense items on us, so I was on my own here. The guy then started ramming the sliding doors like he was crazy. The doors were rattling. I could have sworn they were going to come off their base. Just then, Arya came running back around the corner with a 2x4 in her hand, yelling that the cops were on their way. Finally, the man decided to leave. The closing manager met the officers when they came, and he took them to review the cameras. Thankfully, the man was caught and arrested, but Arya and I felt unsafe working there any longer. We're still friends and even attend the same college together, but we have separate jobs now while we pay our way through classes. I'm glad she was there to help me with the rogue man, as I hate to imagine what he might have done to me, or worse, what he might have done to her. She says she's glad I was there for her as well, as having a guy around tends to make men like him less confident in what they might try. It was a wake-up call for me as to how dangerous it can be for some girls when an interested guy just doesn't want to take no for an answer. During the summer last year, I chose not to take any classes and got a job at a gas station right next to my college campus. I was sort of disillusioned with school and wanted to make some money while I had time off. The gas station was one of the first places I tried applying to, and it turned out to be the last when they hired me on the spot. I thought it was a little weird, but I didn't question it. Unfortunately, they said they only wanted me for the night shift, which was from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. I knew it would wreak havoc on my already messed up sleep schedule, but I decided to go for it and just see how it went. To my surprise, most of the time it wasn't that bad. The first few hours of the shift were pretty busy, and it would get crazy, but then it would always get really slow until about 5 o'clock in the morning. This gave me plenty of time to clean, stock the shelves, and chill out until the morning rush. Occasionally, somebody suspicious or problematic would wander in, but I never had anything get too out of hand. Well, that was of course until something did happen. It was a Thursday, which wasn't usually a busy night. I had a coworker until about midnight, then they went home, and I was left alone. Time went by pretty fast, and before I knew it, it was almost 2 a.m. That's around the time a man walked in, and I immediately had a bad feeling about him. He had a shaved head and a bunch of tattoos of weird symbols, so I was pretty sure he was a skinhead. I noticed he had parked his dirty old lifted pickup truck in the handicap spot too, but I didn't want to get on his case about it. It was 1:58 when he walked in, and he spent a few minutes wandering around the store. In the end, though, all he bought was a case of beer. However, by then it was 2:01. My county has a law that says alcohol can't be purchased between 2 a.m. and 6 a.m. I told the man that, as politely and apologetically as I could, that he couldn't buy the beer. He immediately became agitated and went off on a rant about how it was a free country and that it was a stupid law. I tried my best to reason with him, and I said that I was just trying to do my job. But this only made him start to criticize me like I was some kind of spineless pawn for my boss. That's when I asked him to leave if he was going to be that way. Then he suddenly changed his tone again, acting all chummy and saying it wasn't a big deal and that I should bend the rules for just a few minutes since it was before 2 o'clock when he walked in. He kind of made a good point, so I eventually caved just so he would get out. I sold him the case of beer, and then, of course, he asked for a pack of cigarettes to go with it. I let him have it as there was no rule against tobacco sales. He smiled at me and then left the store. I breathed a sigh of relief, but that relief was short-lived. I thought he would get in his truck and leave, but instead, he opened the tailgate and sat down on the truck bed. He cracked open a can of beer and started drinking it. Now I had a feeling that this was far from over, and that was exactly the case. A few minutes later, another truck pulled up right next to his, and a couple of guys got out, both of them with shaved heads and tattoos. They stood around the back of the first guy's truck, just smoking and drinking. I knew I had to go out there and tell them that they couldn't loiter in front of the store and that it was illegal to drink out in the open like that, especially that close to a car. But I was a little scared already. They kept looking in the window at me, smirking as if they knew what I was thinking and were challenging me to try. Before I could find the courage, another car, this time an SUV, pulled in next to the two of them, and two more guys got out and joined the others. They were all part of the same skinhead group, without a doubt. My guess is they were coming from a bar that had just closed and didn't want to end the night yet. That was the most reasonable explanation, but my paranoid thoughts made me think they were about to get together and burn down the store because the owner's wife was Mexican. Then the first guy came back into the store. He was drunker than before and all smiles. But then he came back to the register with another case of beer. I was about to tell him he definitely couldn't buy it at that time, but before I could even open my mouth, he looked at me all smug and said he really wouldn't want to disappoint him and all of his friends. I took that as a pretty solid threat, so I let him do what he wanted. My hands were shaking, and I was dreading having to count change in front of him. But then he told me to keep the change, like he was giving me some kind of big tip. He walked back outside, and all the skinheads cheered at the fresh case of beer. Apparently, they had worked together and finished all 24 cans of the previous one. I then realized they had been tossing the empty cans all over the ground and kicking them around. It felt like I was completely stuck with these pricks, and I knew I would either get in trouble over it or get literally ganged up on and have any manner of horrible things done to me just for saying no to them. What normal person would see a bunch of drunk skinheads smoking cheap cigarettes on top of their pickup trucks in front of a store in the middle of the night and still want to walk past them to get in? Pretty much nobody, not a single person except more of the skinheads. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I walked up and locked the door so they couldn't get back in. Then I walked back to the office and called the police. Several minutes later, a cruiser showed up and told them to screw off. There was some shouting outside that I couldn't quite make out, but I was worried for a few minutes that things would escalate. Thankfully, they left without causing too much of a scene, but I have no idea how close it got. The cop waited for them to leave before doing so himself. Right before he got on his way, I came out and asked him to stay a while I cleaned up their mess. The next day, I unfortunately had to quit that job. There was nothing more terrifying to me than the thought of being stuck behind that register if those guys ever decided to come back. Still, I kind of get worried that one of them will see me around town and recognize me. I don't know what those people are all capable of. All I know is my town is full of dudes like that, and they're always causing problems. Up until about a year ago, I worked at a grocery chain. I was, and still am, a working college student. My availability was only 6 p.m. to closing, which in this case was midnight. It wasn't my favorite job. I dealt with a lot of annoying customers and coworkers, one of whom once broke into my locker and put a used tampon in the pocket of my apron, but that's a whole different story. My job was walking distance from where I lived, which made it really convenient since I didn't have a car. One Friday night, I was closing as usual with my supervisor, and we were running later than we usually did. My supervisor and I finally got the remaining customers out of the store, clocked out, and left. I left before my supervisor and began walking home. After a long, frustrating day of annoying customers, it felt great to just walk through the fresh winter air. I spent a few minutes shuffling through my phone's playlist to find a song to walk home to. I had made my way down the main road, careful not to slip on any of the ice. One thing that's really important to know about me is that I'm a very anxious person, and while it's definitely a problem most of the time, it does help make me constantly aware of my surroundings. That's when I saw an approaching car slowing down on the deserted main road, and I automatically went on high alert. It was a black car that came to a slow stop against the sidewalk I was on, about 10 feet behind me. I immediately clutched my phone in my hand and brought it out of my pocket. If there wasn't any ice covering the sidewalk and my feet didn't hurt, I probably would have run. Instead, I opted to try and pretend that I wasn't afraid, which I don't think worked because I picked up my pace after the car stopped. It was then that I heard a man's voice call out to me. "Hey, it's cold out here. You want a ride?" the man said. I kept walking away from him up the street, pretending I didn't hear him and just hoping he would go away. It didn't work. A few moments later, I heard the car tires crushing the ice on the road and then turned around to see what he was doing. He was now driving with the car in reverse. When he caught up to me, he had rolled down the passenger seat window some more. He was a black man, maybe in his mid to late 30s. He looked at me and I stopped, prompting him to stop his car as well. "Hey, let me give you a ride," he said through the car window. I didn't know what to say. I wanted to be polite because even though I was scared, I tried to be rational. All he did was offer a girl a ride home who was walking in the cold at night. Also, with the possibility of him being a kidnapper or a rapist, it was really best not to piss him off on the empty street. "No thank you," I said politely but firmly that I hesitated for a second. I was trying to figure out what to say that would get him to leave me alone away which street I lived on. "I'm okay," I insisted. "Thanks, though." As I finished thanking him, I started walking again, now putting both headphones in with the song paused. It was more of a way to signal that I was done talking to him. He didn't say anything, but I knew that he was watching me walk away. I felt relieved when I got a few more feet away from his car and heard the sound of his tires driving away. Unfortunately, the situation was only getting worse. As I started walking past the entrance of a car dealership, I saw the same car making a U-turn in the middle of the street out of the corner of my eye. When I turned slightly, he pulled up to the sidewalk yet again, this time a few feet in front of me. The man then opened the driver's seat door and got out of the car. It was at that point I was actually afraid I wouldn't make it home that night. He looked at me with this weird expression on his face. He had this really focused look while trying to look casual. It's really hard to describe. He started walking up to me. This kind of situation had never happened to me before, but I always thought of dangerous hypothetical situations in my head. I guess thinking about those situations prepared me to an extent because before I even realized it, my phone was already against my ear like I was on the phone with someone, even though I wasn't. When he came closer to me, he saw my phone in my hand and must have realized someone could know where I am right now, or I could be calling 911. That's the only explanation I can think of because when he looked at my phone, his demeanor totally changed. He stopped in his tracks with a worried look on his face and then asked me, "Oh, are you on the phone with someone right now?" I replied, looking at him with my phone still against my face and my other hand casually in my pocket. Without saying anything else, the man immediately turned around, got back in his car, and then started to drive up the street. I walked slowly at first, letting some distance grow between us, but as soon as I felt safer, I walked up the street as fast as I could without slipping. I frantically tried to call my dad, who I thought was home at the time. He didn't pick up. I then tried to call my sister and my fiancé. I didn't feel like I was in danger anymore, but my adrenaline was through the roof and I wanted to hear from someone who would make me feel better. I gave up calling after I couldn't get in touch with anyone and just kept walking. I was finally getting ready to turn onto another street when I passed an empty parking lot and saw the same man leaning against his car looking over at me. "Hey," was all he said in a flat tone when I walked by. At this point, I was completely freaked out. I didn't have my phone out anymore, so I couldn't pretend I was talking to someone again, and I was also significantly closer to my house. If he decided to get into his car and follow me, there wasn't any detour I could take to try and lose him. I was now on the verge of tears, and that's when I decided to call 911. I called 911 and told them the situation. The officer on the other line stayed on the phone with me until I got into my house. After that, an officer came to my house and asked me a bunch of questions about the man. He also asked me about his car and where I last saw him. All of the details were either too vague or I didn't remember. He said that he would at least patrol the area for him. I'm not really sure if he actually did or not, but it made me feel better at the time. From that point, I needed a ride to and from work every shift until I got my schedule changed to day shifts. Just a few weeks later, the college semester ended and I was planning on skipping a semester anyway. That experience only reinforced my decision. The more I think about that situation, the more I realize how lucky I was. I was in the perfect position to be taken, but I actually used some quick thinking that really de-escalated the situation. I moved in with my fiancé, and now I have a pocket knife and pepper spray for whenever I walk home at night from my new job. It's something to remember. If you haven't called 911, if you don't have anything to defend yourself against someone, either let someone know where you are or pretend that they know where you are. It can potentially save your life. As a father of a daughter, this incident will haunt me for the rest of my life. My 16-year-old daughter Laura grew up to be the brightest young lady, and my wife John and I couldn't be prouder of her. Laura was so jolly that she made friends wherever she went. It was the month of November, and everyone was getting ready to celebrate the winter festivals coming our way. Our family celebrated Thanksgiving at my brother's farmhouse every year in Ohio, so we drove there a week before Thanksgiving to make some cheerful memories. One morning, I was headed to the bank to finish some important paperwork before leaving for Ohio when I noticed a boy standing on the sidewalk facing our house and looking at the window of my daughter's room. He was smiling while staring at Laura's room. I was about to knock him out, thinking he was stalking her, but when I looked up, I saw Laura was standing in front of her window and waving at him with a blushed face. I realized now that they knew each other, so it would be better to talk to Laura first before hurling on this boy. I left and decided to sit down with Laura and talk that night. After finishing dinner, Laura was heading upstairs. I stopped her and told her to sit next to me. "I wanted to talk to you about that boy." "Who? What are you saying, Dad?" "Relax, Laura, you don't have to be afraid. I just wanted to know who he is." Her face turned red as she hesitated for some time. "Honey, don't be afraid. We just want the best for you. Come on, tell us about him, John added. His name is Ross. He is in my class. Okay, where does he live? 2 blocks away. His dad is the local sheriff. Really? That's good. I know the sheriff. So how long have you guys been friends? We met at a science fair. He is a nice guy, Dad. We like each other. Okay, I don't have any issues, but we need to set some boundaries for your safety. No matter how much John mocked me for becoming a bit possessive about my daughter, it was natural. I set the common boundaries that any dad would to protect his teenage daughter in her growing years. Soon, I started to see Ross walking Laura home after school. I couldn't find anything wrong with him, and being the sheriff's son, I was a bit relieved, thinking maybe he is better than other high school boys. One day, I was coming home from work, and on my way, I stopped at the local department store to buy some necessary things before leaving for Thanksgiving. There, I met the local sheriff, Mr. Daniel Truman. He was shopping for some groceries as well. I walked up to him and said, "Hello, Daniel." "Hey, how are you, Alex?" "I am good." "So, any plans for Thanksgiving?" "Not much, going to stay home with my son, I guess." "Talking about your son, are you aware that he and my daughter are becoming friends now?" I expected him to be happy about it, but instead, his face turned all serious, and he replied, "I see. What happened? Is something bothering you?" "No, just hoping they will be friends and nothing else." Saying this, he walked past me, and I felt very humiliated. I couldn't move for a few minutes as a sudden rude behavior caught me off guard. I came home and told my wife about this encounter. She too couldn't guess what could be the reason behind Sheriff Daniel's off-putting attitude. I mean, both the kids belong to good families, then why did he seem so upset his son was going out with my daughter? I didn't tell Laura all about this because I didn't want to complicate things for her at such a young age. We started to pack for our trip, and slowly this matter slipped away from my mind. 2 nights before our trip to Ohio, Laura came to me and said she doesn't want to go to her uncle's farmhouse this year. I asked her why. Laura remained silent, keeping her face down. I asked if she wished to spend Thanksgiving with Ross, and her face lit up immediately. I couldn't see my daughter sad, so I told her Ross could come with us if he wants to. Laura ran to call him, but I made sure his father agrees only then. The main reason why I allowed Ross to tag along was to keep my daughter close and also not to break her heart in this vulnerable age. The next morning, Ross came to my house. We talked about this entire trip thing, and I was stunned to see how confident he was. He was way more mature than half of the kids his age. He said his father has approved, and he is ready to come with us. Without much to do, we hopped into the car and got on the road. Ross was very well behaved, and my wife John kept saying the entire journey how cute they both looked. After driving for 3 hours, we reached Crystal Lake. The sun was about to set, and a dying yellow light mixed with the blue night sky made the horizon look like a dream. My brother and his family greeted us in the house, and Laura introduced everyone to Ross. To my surprise, Ross won everyone over in a very short span. He was helping in the kitchen, playing with the kids, and also showed interest when we watched the game. It didn't feel at all like he was an outsider. Although he was settling completely well, I couldn't help but feel a bit weird about all this. I don't know why things were seeming too good to be true to me at that moment. As the night fell, we all sat down for dinner, and everyone was laughing and cheering. I was about to shove a big piece of beef steak in my mouth when my phone rang. I noticed it on the couch, so I got up and walked to get it. Everyone else didn't pay much attention to me and kept enjoying themselves. It was a call from an unknown number. As I picked it up, I could hear sirens of cop cars driving at fast speed as the sound of wind hovered through the phone speaker. "Hello, who is it?" "Alex, you must listen to me. This is Sheriff Truman. Act calm and go somewhere where my son can't hear you, please. Don't ask any questions or take my name, just do what I say." Even though I was confused like hell, my instinct said to follow the sheriff's instructions. Without expressing anything, I slowly walked out of the room to the back garden of the house. I closed the glass door behind me, and no one noticed me. Ronald was laughing with everyone else. I am alone now. What the hell is going on, Daniel? Where is Ronald now? In the living room. Eating dinner with my family. Will you please tell me what's going on here? Alex, my son is a deranged psychopath, and the only reason I wanted to keep him away from your daughter was to keep them both safe. I know I should have done something earlier, but as a father, I kept on burying the vicious crimes he did since he was 4 years old. First, he killed his pet dog and then started harming animals. But when he bludgeoned my wife to death, knowing she was pregnant with another child, I realized what devil we had brought into this world. He can't share those whom he thinks as his close ones. I didn't permit him to travel with you guys, so he threatened me with a gun and tied me up in the basement. When I finally managed to set myself free, I noticed he was going with one of my guns. He has taken them all and is going to murder your entire family to get Laura just for himself. You must stop him before becoming violent. Keep a close eye on him. I'm coming to your place. I have already tracked down your location from this call. Just please don't make him mad, or he will snap out like a venomous snake." Saying all this in one go, the sheriff disconnected the call, and I turned around with fearful eyes to my loving family, who were now seen laughing with a deranged murderer that has come with a plan to finish them all. I uttered to myself that I must keep calm and protect my family. I got inside and went straight to Ronald's room. My idea was to take the guns away, but as I opened his rucksack, I saw dozens of knives and other basic weapons, but the gun was missing. Seems like you and my dad both want to ruin my Thanksgiving this year. I turned back and found Ronald standing behind me with a gun. I lunged at him to take it away, but he dodged carefully and hit me on the head with the middle end of the gun. I fell unconscious on the floor with throbbing pain and heard Ronald say, "Happy Thanksgiving." I don't remember when I came back to my senses, but a squashy sound followed by a metallic smell started to take over my drowsy mind. I opened my eyes slowly and saw Laura tied up to a chair with a huge bruise on her head. She was unconscious as well, but as I laid my eyes around, I realized the danger is much bigger than this. All my family members, my wife, my brother, his wife, and his 2 kids, were lying on the floor bludgeoned to death. Yes, Ronald killed them all. What have you done? Oh, Alex, you're awake. Nothing, just getting what is mine. My dad had never understood me, but don't know why I think you will. I love your daughter, and I want her. I love her so much that I can't share her with anyone, not even her family, not even you. He raised his gun at me once again, and just then, the main door slammed open, and I heard 6 gunshots back to back. Bullets pierced his chest like crazy, and he fell on the floor, vomiting blood. As his lifeless body fell on the ground, I saw Sheriff Truman standing behind him with his empty gun. That night, a father shot his son to save another father and his daughter. I surely lost my family at the hands of a psychopath. And this pain will never go away. But whenever I think about Truman, who will have to live with this realization that he killed his son, I find my suffering small compared to him. Laura and I don't celebrate Thanksgiving anymore because neither of us feels thankful about anything in this life anymore. Thanksgiving night, I was over at my parents' house for dinner since they were hosting this year. I got to see some cousins and uncles I hadn't seen in almost a year. We had a typical Thanksgiving gathering for our family. My parents cooked a big meal as usual. Before dinner, though, I got a long essay of a text from some unknown number. I won't share it because it contains a lot of personal revealing details, but it started with, "Hey Melissa, hope your Thanksgiving is going well." Then I quickly came to realize who it was that sent this text. It was this crazy stalker guy named Kevin, who I'd never even met before. We matched on a dating app and texted and snapped for a while, but we never met. He gave me obsessive vibes, and when I politely rejected going on a date with him, saying I don't think we have much in common, he got even more obsessive and aggressive. He even threatened me one time when I posted a Snap story of my friend and I getting drinks because he thought I was on a date with a guy. That was when I blocked him on everything, Snapchat, Instagram, and his number. But the contact didn't stop there. I got random Instagram accounts with 0 followers attempting to follow me, and I blocked them each time. Same thing on Snapchat. I'd get random accounts adding me with different guys' names every time. Whenever I'd add them back out of curiosity, their Snap scores were always 0. After reading the entire message, I was disgusted. He was gaslighting me and borderline threatening me. I replied, "If you keep contacting me, I will go to the police." I took so long to form a reply I was okay with that my grandma got annoyed and asked me to put my phone away. It was only out of sight and out of mind for me for half an hour before I got another text from another random number. It was another essay. I didn't want to completely ruin my mood and be on my phone dealing with this when I was with family. I put my phone away and just tried to focus on being a part of the conversation. When family started to leave and things started to slow down, I checked the text, and it was disturbing. It was longer than the first one, and it was him berating me and insulting me the entire time, acting like the entitled, narcissistic sociopath that he clearly is. When there was just a small amount of my family left, I showed them the texts, and they were appalled. My mom wanted me to go to the police the next day to report him for harassment, which I planned on doing. I soon left my parents' house to go home to my apartment. My apartment is the lower floor of a 2-family house. My friend Chelsea is my roommate. In the apartment, I got home before her and went straight to my room to look for Christmas movies to watch. My phone started ringing, and it said unknown caller. I knew it was him. I denied it and silenced my phone. I put on some silly rom-com Christmas movie to fall asleep to. It was called Surviving Christmas. All I remember about it is that it had James Gandolfini in it. It was late at night, so I didn't plan on making it through the movie. I was getting sleepy halfway through the movie when I heard walking from outside my room in the house. It was in the apartment, not from upstairs, so I assumed it was Chelsea getting home from her night with her family. The footsteps came straight to my door, then someone attempted to open my door. I always lock my bedroom door at night, even though I trust Chelsea. It's just a natural habit I have. I paused the movie and listened as the doorknob turned a few more times before I yelled, "Chelsea." Then it stopped. I heard quiet footsteps walking away from the door. I grabbed my phone, about to call Chelsea, and I saw a bunch of texts on my screen from a third random number. The most alarming one was a threat saying, "Good thing you made it obvious where you live." I tried calling Chelsea like 5 times, but she never picked up. I called my parents a bunch of times until my dad picked up, and I whispered into the phone that I think that crazy stalker was in the house. My dad said to stay put, he was coming over right away. We lived 10 minutes away from each other, but he made it to me in 5. That's how fast he drove here. During that time, I stayed on the phone with my dad the whole time until Chelsea called me back, and that's when she told me that she wasn't coming back to the apartment tonight, so it for sure was not her. When my dad got here, the front door was locked. I had to let him in. I swore to him that I wasn't imagining what happened, and so after we tore the place upside down, he went to the big sliding window by the kitchen, big enough that anyone could fit through, and he lifted it open. He turned to me and gave me a stare of disappointment. He scolded me after learning that I didn't lock the window every night and said, "Here's my answer on how someone got in here." I went back home with him and slept at home that night. First thing in the morning, my dad took me to the county court's office where they gave us step-by-step instructions for getting a temporary restraining order. Skipping most of the legal process of the story, I eventually did see Kevin in person when I had to go to court to get the restraining order extended. The judge granted the extension, and though I could never prove he broke into my apartment, his threatening texts were plenty, and if he ever contacts me again through any outlets, he'd be arrested. This was a truly dangerous man, and I hope he hasn't found anyone else to harass. It was Black Friday 2013, and I decided to be one of those people who gets up at 3 a.m. to get some early deals. Home Depot was having crazy deals on artificial Christmas trees, so I wanted to get there early and buy one for my family. They opened their doors at 3 a.m. on the spot, 3 hours earlier than usual for Black Friday. Surprisingly, only me and one other guy were waiting to get in. I guess everyone else was at Best Buy or the mall. I found a nice 9-foot tall artificial Christmas tree, originally for $200, but at that moment half off for only $100. I asked one of the few employees working at that hour to help me carry the box to the checkout and then to my car. The parking lot was still surprisingly empty for Black Friday. I figured maybe I didn't have to come so early. I tipped the guy and got in my car, ready to leave, when someone knocked on my window. I lowered the window and saw some guy in his mid-20s, wearing a beanie, black and tall, leaning into my window asking if I had change. I opened the little compartment between the seats where I normally keep change, and it was actually empty. I didn't want to have to hand him a $10, so I said, "Nah, man, sorry." He looked disappointed, and I actually felt bad. He then asked me if I could give him a lift to the nearest gas station. I was a bit nervous about letting a stranger in my car, but guess what? I let him in. He did not thank me, which kind of hurt, I guess, because I'm a little sensitive. I asked him if he knew of any close-by gas stations. He just said, "Nah." A few seconds later, I asked him why he needed to go to a gas station, and I swear to God he didn't answer. It's not like he didn't hear me, he just flat out ignored me. I stopped looking at him at that point because I was feeling a bit uncomfortable. I kept driving down main and side roads, but there were no goddamn gas stations anywhere. I was trying not to look in his direction, but I could tell he was staring at me every turn I made, every stop sign I stopped at. He was staring at me. I was sweating now. This guy was freaking me out. I felt like at any moment he could just grab my throat and I'd be done for. At last, I could see a gas station just beyond a light, which had just turned red. Why did it have to turn red just now? I thought to myself. I could still feel his stare, even as I looked the other way. I finally decided to sum up the courage and looked at him. I felt his cold, emotionless stare run straight through my eyes into my soul. Are you okay?" I asked him. He ever so slightly nodded his head, almost not even noticeable. The light turned green, and I pulled into the gas station. He stepped out and stood by the sidewalk and watched me as I pulled away. When I got past the intersection, I laughed out of joy and the ridiculousness of the situation. But then I realized something. I patted myself down and then began to panic. I was missing something, my phone. I was only a few blocks away, so I made a U-turn and headed back to the gas station. He was already gone. I drove home and confirmed that my phone was missing. I knew I had left it in the cup holder of my car. My phone had all of my info on it. I contemplated calling the police, but I didn't. I couldn't even sleep that night in fear of some freak stranger having my address. The next night, after getting home from our 2-day delayed Thanksgiving dinner, I found my front door was open and my entire house was trashed. I called the police with my neighbor's phone. They didn't find him in there, but they found his prints everywhere. The only thing, the prints did not match anyone on record. The New York City subway system is a scary place. I've been an MTA worker for 7 years, and nothing really surprises me anymore. When friends and family ask if I have any stories, though, there is one that stands out among the rest, one that I can't explain. This happened to me about 2 years into the job, but I remember it like it was yesterday. I was pretty acclimated to everything at that point, and things had become routine. I was stationed in Brooklyn at the time, and I was doing some routine maintenance in High Street Station. There wasn't a soul on the platform. It was actually kind of eerie. You're used to these subway stations overflowing with people, so seeing them empty and almost deserted looking was a strange adjustment to make. I hadn't seen a person on the platform in hours, and it was dead silent except for the buzz of the lights and the occasional passing train. Out of nowhere, I heard a clang from somewhere down the track. It startled me so badly that I dropped my mop in shock. The sound wasn't something I was used to hearing. The best way I could describe it to you is that sound that a rock would make if it had been dropped on a metal rail. I stopped what I was doing and looked into the tunnel, listening for other noises. After a while, I concluded that whatever I heard had either been caused by an animal or a falling piece of cement. After all, these stations were pretty old. I went back to work, not thinking too much about the sound. About 10 minutes later, the same sound shook me from my concentration. Only this time, it was probably about twice as loud. This time, I actually became a little concerned, dare I say, scared. Was it really possible that 2 chunks of the ceiling had fallen in the span of 10 minutes? I put down my supplies and walked over to the tunnel entrance, trying to be quiet. I peered into the darkness and couldn't really see anything. I debated whether or not it was a good idea to call out into the tunnel and ultimately decided against it. I still figured it was nothing, but after the initial fear had worn off, I was more confused than anything. I kept trying to think of things that could make a sound like that, not once, but twice. It was especially bizarre since the second sound was louder. I tried to keep my mind off the sounds and went back to work, finding a good rhythm again. I was almost done with my work on this platform and was pleased that I'd get to leave this weird station soon. As I was wrapping things up, I heard something that gave me the chills. A child's voice called out for help from inside the tunnel, and he sounded like he was in distress. I instantly stopped what I was doing and made my way over to the edge of the platform. I hesitated for a few seconds before deciding that a child in anguish wasn't something my moral conscience would allow me to ignore. I walked down the steps leading onto the tracks and waited for my eyes to adjust to the darkness. I shouted into the tunnel, asking the kid if he was okay. No response. That's weird, I thought, starting to feel nervous about this encounter. Just then, the kid's voice rang out again, repeating his call for help. I yelled back, asking him if he could hear me. He responded, yes, and I asked where specifically he was. There was a brief moment of silence before he just said, in front of you. Just keep walking. I really didn't want to, but couldn't just leave some helpless kid all alone on those tracks. It was dangerous. I began walking forward when something dawned on me. I yelled into the darkness one more time, this time asking the kid what was wrong. An uncomfortable pause again before the kid responded, just keep walking. I didn't like that. This whole thing was off. My eyes finally adjusted to the darkness, and I was able to slightly make out what was in front of me. There actually was what looked like the shadow of a kid just up the tracks, but there was something else that almost made me scream in fear, another shadow, this one much taller, obviously an adult. My blood ran cold, and I stopped in place. This wasn't happening to me. As slowly as I could, I turned around and made my way back to the platform. Luckily, I wasn't chased on the way back. The kid shouted, "Wait, where are you going?" once I reached the platform, but I wasn't sticking around another second. I made my way up the stairs and called the police as soon as I got cell service. I told them everything, and police were swarming the platform in a matter of minutes. I waited to see what they turned up. After about 30 minutes of searching, they did find something chilling. There was a single kid shoe just lying in the tunnel, which the police hypothesized could have signified a struggle. After hours more of searching and scouring every available database for missing children, we were told we'd receive a call if anything ever came up. It was concluded that whoever had been down there, though, had hidden somewhere in the tunnels. I have no idea what to think of this experience. This is the best theory I can come up with. Some psycho kidnapped a child and forced him to yell for help in an attempt to lure some unsuspecting Good Samaritan into a trap. Or hell, maybe it's their own kid who they're raising to also be a psycho. I can't think of any other reasonable explanation besides this one. But if I'm right, I can only imagine what that kid must be going through. I come from a small town in Pennsylvania, and I've lived here all of my life. I'm 17 years old, and the time this story took place, I was around 14 years old. My memory around this is a little hazy because I don't like to talk about it, but I figured I'd let out any dark feelings I still get by it. It may not be considered a scary story, but to me, this was probably one of the most scariest things that I've ever been through. At the time this happened, I was an 8th grader in middle school. During the time, my mom worked at Panera Bread, and she had to work very early in the morning, so me and my sister would usually take the bus to school while my dad and my little brother, who was around 4 years old at the time, would stay home. This will be important later. It was like any other ordinary day. Me and my sister would get ready and leave at around 7:20 a.m. to walk to our bus stop. We lived in an apartment complex, and we would have to walk the 3 minutes to the front of the apartment because that's where the bus would pick us up. A little background information: me and my sister would meet up with our friends at the bus stop since we lived in the same apartment complex, and we would wait until the bus showed up. I would stay at the back with my friend, while my sister and her friend would be towards the front, 5 feet from the stop. So, like our usual routine, I had met up with my friend, Reed, and my sister would meet up with her friend, who I'll call Lelia. We waited for the bus to show up. Me and Reed would always see this boy, who I'll refer to as Scott. He was a year younger than us, and he would always run across the street to our bus stop to get a seat since we would be the first to be picked up. This was because by the time the bus driver would pick him up, he'd be the last person, and there would be no seats left for him to sit at. So he began to run across the street, and we were used to seeing him run across like that. Reed and I would always laugh at the way he ran, but wouldn't pay any more attention after he made it across. This will also be important. So, as we're waiting for the bus to arrive, me and my friend were talking, and there would be 5 other kids waiting for the bus at the front of the apartments as well. And like always, we see Scott across the street, waiting for the bus to arrive. A few minutes go by, and we see the yellow bus coming towards our stop. So everyone on our side begins to gather their belongings, and we begin to form a line as the bus gets closer. It begins to blink its lights, and the stop sign starts to come out at the side, as a sign for the other cars to stop. And for just a second, I begin to see Scott running across. I don't give it 2 thoughts since this was normal, and I began to hear the screeching noise coming from the opposite side of the road. It was like everything was going in slow motion during those couple of seconds, and I remember hearing the screeching noise become louder and louder. As I'm picking up my head to see what the noise was, I heard a big thump noise, and what I saw next will forever remain in my mind until this day. I hear a big thump noise, and I then see Scott flying in the air. I then see Scott hitting the ground so hard, and the noise was so loud as he then made an impact to the street. I remember hearing my friend Reed then scream at the top of her lungs, and I then quickly looked at the car, and I saw the driver inside. I remember seeing the bus driver quickly taking out his walkie-talkie attached to his radio as he was then saying all these codes into it. I then see Scott running around the bus and towards where our bus stop was, and he then had his arms wrapped around his stomach, and he was bleeding all around his head. He also had these cuts on his face, and he was crying wildly. During that moment, I was so horrified that I froze, and I was so scared to say anything. The driver then came out of the car and began to panic, then sang to Scott, "Oh my God, man, I'm so sorry. I never even saw you. I was looking down for 1 second, and then it just happened." But Scott was in so much pain, then he didn't even pay attention to him. Then this kid in my sister's grade ran up to him, then sang, "Hey, man, do you need an ambulance?" Scott was just crying, then shaking his head yes. The boy then took out his phone and called 911, telling the operator everything that happened. The driver then fell to the ground, took a cell phone out, and began to call someone. He then put it on speaker, and once the person picked up and said hello, he'd been sad, "Mom," to the kid, "So sorry." And he then began to break down in tears, and he just kept repeating that same line over and over again. The driver's mother had tried to calm him down, and then the driver just said, "Please forgive me, please. And even my car, it's a friend's car." Scott just stayed on the ground, lying there, as everyone watched him. The next thing I remember was that Scott always had his mother and brother take him to the bus stop, and they would always make sure he got on, but on this day, they never went with him to the bus stop. I then began to check on my sister, making sure she was okay. Her and her friends seemed a little shaken up, but they were okay. Reed's mom and sister were running up to us, and I remember hugging them. At that moment, I felt so alone and horrified. I began to cry hysterically, and my sister was just trying to comfort me. Something that I always regret was never telling my parents right away about what happened. I didn't want to wake and worry my dad, and I didn't want to get my mom in trouble for leaving early. I knew that she suffered from anxiety, so I didn't want to give her a panic attack, which she would get every once in a while. So, my sister and I just decided to wait there. I remember calling my friend, who I'll call Kara. I remember that her and her mom worked at the school next to ours, and I began to tell her everything that happened. I began to break down. They quickly alerted the front desk, and she calmed me down, telling me everything was going to be okay. I know some of you might be thinking, how was I able to call my friend but not my parents? But during that moment, I just felt the need to call Cindy because she was who I trusted at the time, and we're still friends to this day. About 20 minutes later, the ambulance arrived. They began to check Scott and treat him while he was lying on the ground, still crying and in pain. 10 minutes passed, and I began to come at ease. They started to place him on the stretcher. I remember seeing his mom and brother running with a paramedic towards him, and they had the most worried and horrified faces that I've ever seen. I began to feel so sad for them. Reed, my sister, and I thought it would be okay if we went to school just to try and take our minds off of everything that happened and all of the horror we witnessed 40 minutes ago. We were at our bus stop for almost an hour, and we still got picked up at the next stop and then immediately went to school. I remember the staff waiting there for us and separating the apartment complex bus stop kids, escorting us to the library. I won't go into too much detail, but they pretty much stated that we could stop by the counselor's office anytime during the school day, and if we wanted to leave school, we were able to. After that event, I didn't take the bus for 4 months and was dropped off. I didn't want to cross the street, and whenever I would hear a tire screech, I would always jump and begin to get a cold sweat. A few months later, I began to feel better and continued to live a normal life. After that, Scott didn't go to school until months later, until he was finally okay, towards the end of the year. Like I said, I know this wasn't the typical stalker story, but this was one horrific event that I went through, and I never want to go through it again. But remember to stay safe out there. I really hope many people don't ever have to witness what I and the other kids had to see that day. It was truly awful. My name is Valor. I'm 24 years old, and this was the most horrifying experience of my life. I live and work in New York City, but I don't have a car, so my main mode of transportation is the subway. It was a Saturday night. I was on my way home from a party in the middle of the night. I did this about every other weekend, so I was completely fine with taking the subway alone at night. Walking down the steps, entering the underground without a soul in sight, it was always a bit chilling. This specific station was very tightly spaced. As I was walking, I could almost feel as if I were being watched or followed, along with the occasional echoing bang-type sound emitting from an unknown location. I was early for the train, so I sat on a bench and waited. This is something straight out of a horror movie. I heard this exact phrase, "Over here, buddy." There was somebody standing on the tracks inside the tunnel, poking his head out and looking at me. It was a filthy-looking man, I'd say in his early 40s. He gave me a smile, a horrible yellow smile with at least 3 teeth missing, and I could tell that even from where I was sitting. I did the best I could to pay no attention to him, but he wouldn't go away. There was laughing coming from inside the tunnel, and then another disgusting-looking man stuck his face out as well. This man gave me a nasty smile as well before telling me to come hang out with them in the tunnel. The way they stared at me, though, their eyes wouldn't even move, it's as if their sight was locked onto me. I resumed doing the best I could to ignore them and just wait for the train. I noticed in my peripheral vision that one of the men moved away into the tunnel, returning moments later with another face. I had to look again. There was a third face, but this one was hunched over and lifeless. It looked like one of the men was holding the guy's face up. The sound of the train approaching felt like 1,000 pounds off my shoulders. I got up, ready to board the train, but when I got closer to the edge of the platform, I nearly threw up at the sight. The two men were going back into the tunnel, and the second man in the back was holding something in his hand, a head, just a head, like a decapitated head. They disappeared from sight onto the side of the tunnel as the train stopped. I got into the first car, planning on warning the conductor, but no later than after we left the station. I didn't want to be there a second longer. As the train began to move, I saw legs moving down the stairs to the platform, but that was it. I didn't get to see who it was. But what I did get to see as the train moved into the tunnels was a glimpse of a group of men hunched up against the railing, inches away from the train window, and they were all looking right at me. I knocked on the conductor's door like a madman, screaming it was an emergency. He opened up, and I explained what I just saw. He radioed to somebody in charge of the station as well as another higher-up of the company, who I'm sure took care of it or contacted the proper authorities or security, whatever. It seemed to take ages for my stop to come, but when it did, I practically had to hop in my walk from relief. I have since been to one party at the same friend's house, but I skipped that station. I decided it was worth it to take the extra long walk to the next station. I don't know if weird shit happens often in the subway at night. In my experience prior to this incident, it never did. But after this experience, I think I should say you should be extremely cautious when in an isolated place like a subway station late at night. Before I get started telling you about the worst night of my life, which was actually supposed to be the best night of my life, I have to give you a little bit of backstory to make it make sense. You see, the man I ended up marrying is the exact opposite of the men I dated in my younger years. I'm not ashamed to say that I'm a recovered drug addict, but that should also tell you something about the people I used to hang around and, at some points, date. I wasn't raised in the nicest of neighborhoods, and I didn't have the kind of parents that cared what I did or where I went. I was lucky if I came home and there was actually food in the fridge. I ended up dropping out at 14 and moving in with my boyfriend at the time. He was 23. Yeah, I know what you're all thinking. A 23-year-old with a 14-year-old girl is gross and in no way okay. But I was 14. I thought it was cool that an older guy wanted to be with me. My parents didn't even question where I was going when they saw me moving things out of the house, so I just figured everything was fine. My friends from school kept telling me not to move in with him, but I thought they were just jealous. So I did it anyway and cut all of them out of my life. Now, we'll call this guy that I moved in with Danny. Danny was a meth addict. I say was, but honestly, I'm 99% sure that he still is. The house I moved into was completely disgusting, with rotting floors, mold everywhere, and random people coming in and out all day and during all hours of the night. Part of me regretted moving in with him, but I was stubborn and didn't want to prove my friends right. Besides, life with Danny was fun, or so my 14-year-old self thought. We would smoke all the time. He got me whatever I wanted, by shoplifting, of course, and he was nice to me. Well, not actually nice to me. He would compliment me and tell me how amazing I was and that he loved me, but at the same time, he would hit me whenever he got high. He always apologized after, and I always forgave him. After all, I had nowhere to go, and he always reminded me that no one would ever love me as much as he did. Well, I bet you can guess what happened next. I eventually got hooked on meth. I was 15 when he first asked me if I wanted to try it. I said no a few times, but he kept pressuring me and begging me just to try it, and I finally gave in. I couldn't describe the exact feeling to you even if I wanted to. All I knew was that I needed to feel that feeling again. I think I finally realized I had a problem about a year in when I couldn't stop. I had to have it. I couldn't even go half a day without getting high, and it was all I thought about, and it completely consumed me. One day, I ran into one of my childhood friends who was a few years older than me at the store when I was about 18 years old. She just gasped when she saw me. Her mouth was wide open as she stared at me, and I knew why. I looked horrible. My teeth were rotting, my hair was disgusting, the clothes I wore were ratty. I was gross, and I have no problem admitting that. It is what it is. When she finally managed to speak, all she said was, "What happened to you?" At that moment, all I felt was shame. I wanted to shrivel up in a little ball and disappear. We actually ended up talking for a few hours that day, and for some reason, I told her everything that had happened in the few years since we last talked. She listened to me, hugged me, and told me that she wanted to help me. Her husband worked at a rehabilitation center, and she was sure that she could get me in if I was willing. I honestly didn't think that I was ready for that, but I also knew that I probably would never be ready. I had this opportunity right in front of me to get help, and I knew so many people didn't have that, so I took it. I agreed to go to rehab. I left Danny that night, and when he found out where I was going, anger didn't even begin to cover how he felt. He beat me, threw all my stuff on the grass outside the house, lit it on fire, and told me dying was the only way I would ever be rid of him. I said nothing. I called my friend, and she and her husband were at the house in just under 10 minutes. Danny screamed and yelled as I got in the car. As we were driving away, he told me my life would be nothing without him. I left and I never looked back. I got through rehab and have been clean for the past 10 years. I won't lie to you and tell you that it's been easy, it hasn't. I was instructed by one of my therapists in rehab to move out of state so I wouldn't be surrounded by the same people and places that influenced me in the first place. So, I did as she said and moved to Montana. I went back to school, got my GED, and eventually went to college and graduated with a teaching degree. I got a job at the local elementary school teaching history and met the man I now call my husband. I never knew that I could be so happy, that a man could treat me so well, but there I was, the happiest I'd ever been in my life, with a stable job and in a serious, incredible relationship. When he asked me to marry him, I was overjoyed. I was so excited. I began planning immediately, and of course, the guest list would be on the small side, but that wasn't important. I was just happy to be getting married to the man of my dreams. The day the wedding rolled around, I was nervous, not cold feet nervous, just nervous and excited for the day and hoping that it would be as amazing as I thought it would be. I was wrong, and I'll tell you why. The ceremony went perfectly. We said our vows, everyone cried, including me, and it was amazing. It was everything I had dreamed of and more. Then came the reception. We booked a fairly small outdoor venue and paid to have those big party tents set up in case it started to rain and we would still be covered. People began making their toasts, and when the time came, my husband and I began our first dance together as husband and wife. As I held on to my husband's arm while we swayed to the music, I swore I was going crazy when I saw him. I knew it had to be a dumb joke my mind was playing on me, but it was no joke. He was really there, and I froze, terrified, as I watched him make his way toward me carrying something that was covered by a blood-soaked towel. I couldn't speak. I don't know why I couldn't, but no words would come out no matter how much I tried. Maybe it was a panic attack, but either way, I was desperately looking around at other people, hoping they noticed what was scaring me so bad. My husband was whispering something in my ear, but I couldn't even hear him. Everything was being tuned out, and the only thing I could focus on was Danny getting closer and closer to me with every step he took. Finally, someone noticed, and I was relieved when I saw my husband's brother get out of his seat and physically stop Danny from getting any closer to me. And that's when he did it. He uncovered what he was carrying and threw it right in my face. It hit me hard. Whatever it was heavy and wet and hit me with so much force I was on the ground in seconds. I couldn't believe what was happening. I looked down and noticed that I was covered in blood. The room started spinning, and I started hyperventilating. I could hear Danny screaming, but at that point, I couldn't focus enough on anything to tell what he was saying, and finally, I just passed out. When I woke up, I was in the back of an ambulance, getting my dress cut off so they could look for wounds. They weren't exactly sure if the blood was mine or if it all came from the pig's head. Yes, you read that right, Danny had actually thrown a severed pig's head directly at my face. I had a few cuts on my face from where the head hit me and had unfortunately swallowed some of the blood that had forced its way into my mouth on impact. My husband apparently insisted I be taken to the hospital to test for any diseases I may have gotten from it. After I passed out, a bunch of men in my husband's family tackled Danny to the ground and beat him severely until he was bloody and unconscious. When the police got there, they also just ended up taking him to the hospital as well, where he was treated for internal injuries from the beating. I was fine apart from the mental trauma and a couple of scrapes and bruises from where I was hit. My husband and I had a second ceremony a few months later, much smaller, at his parents' house to try to make up for the day that had been ruined for both of us, and it was perfect. It's just how I wanted my wedding day to be remembered. Now, Danny was sentenced to 5 years in prison with 5 years probation after his eventual release. I was relieved when I heard how long his sentence was. The mental trauma that I have has been awful, but my husband always makes me feel safe. He assured me that he would never let anything happen to me like that again, and I believed him. It wasn't his fault. We've been married now for 5 years, and I figured I'd tell this story now as Danny is set to be released in the coming months. Lately, all I do is pray to God that he isn't mad enough to pull something like that again or do something even worse. I live in a safe town, the kind of town where you can leave your car doors unlocked. Hell, you can usually get away with leaving the doors to your house unlocked. The crime rate is very low, and I live on a dead-end block. I had just gotten home from work around 7 p.m. after a 10-hour shift and was preparing a late dinner when the phone rang. The second I picked up, I heard the sound of the person on the other end hanging up. I don't know if this has any correlation with what's to come, but if it does, that's even more horrifying. On nights when I get home late, especially after 10-hour shifts, usually I'll just cook, eat, clean up, take a shower, then lay in bed watching TV for an hour before going to sleep. This was one of those nights. I was physically and mentally exhausted, which led me to making what I learned that night was a serious mistake. I was laying in bed watching One Piece for my third run. Sometimes I'll drift off to sleep with the TV still on when I'm just completely beat, and that's exactly what happened this night. I woke up to the TV still playing the One Piece. I had slept through 2 episodes. I felt around the bed for the remote and turned it off. In the now freshly silent room, I was able to hear little creaks in the wood under the carpet. I felt adrenaline kick in as I looked across the dark room. I felt I could vaguely see the shape of a very wide figure. As I aimed the remote at the TV to turn it back on to light up the room, before the TV was even on, I started choking on my own spit as I tried to say, "Please leave." The TV came back on, and the room lit up a tint of blue, revealing this woman in a wedding dress looking at me with the veil covering her face. I tried to scream at first, but nothing came out of my mouth because I was just in pure shock. I sat up, pressed against the headboard of my bed, frozen. That's the best way I can describe what I was doing in that moment. The woman in the dress, whose face I could barely see, walked over to the bed whispering, "Where is my groom?" over and over, but each time she said it, she got louder. Her whisper quickly turned to a yell, and she grabbed the edge of my mattress and started shaking it. I screamed back at her to leave me alone. Then I got off the bed, pushed her, and ran to the bathroom across the hall and locked the door. She followed me, trying to open the door, banging on it and repeating the words, "Where's my groom?" I yelled at her, "I'm calling the cops," and luckily I had my cell phone on me. The woman was crying now on the other side of the door, still knocking and banging. The last thing I heard her say was, "I have to get to my wedding." I heard her stomp down my stairs, screaming and crying. Then I heard the front door slam shut. I was on the phone with 911, and I explained what just happened. I checked the living room, and she was gone. I stepped outside to see if I could see which way she ran, but she was out of sight. A police officer showed up shortly, and I described her as some larger woman in a white wedding dress and veil, how she was screaming, "Where's my groom?" and "I have to get to my wedding." I couldn't help with the direction she ran to. It was either down the only direction the street goes or the woods to the right. Because of my exhaustion after my 10-hour shift, I had forgotten to simply lock my door, something I honestly never even thought was a problem in my neighborhood. But this just goes to show that even in the best of neighborhoods, you're not always safe from crazy people out there. I think this woman was off her rocker and belonged in a mental asylum, and I hope police or somebody found her roaming the streets that night and brought her somewhere to get her help. Weddings are stressful. Too stressful. I just wanted to elope, but my wife refused. She wanted a huge, all-out, super expensive wedding, and even though I could afford it, that was literally my nightmare. I guess she and I were the opposite of each other, but the term opposites attract really did apply in this situation. I had never loved anyone the way I loved her. Anyways, I agreed to the extravagant big wedding on one condition: I got to pick the food. She didn't like that at all, but I stood my ground and told her that it was the only way that she would get what she wanted. Eventually, she agreed, and that started the journey of trying to find the perfect food for the big day. I knew that it had to be something to cheer me up, given the whole day was going to be the opposite of how I'd hoped. I went to multiple restaurants that served all different types of food, but choosing was proving to be a lot harder than I had planned. About a week before the wedding, my soon-to-be wife, Ella, asked me what I had ended up choosing for the wedding. My heart sunk, and I could feel my face getting red when I realized that I had completely forgotten to make a decision at all. I couldn't even look at her when she asked me a second time after I failed to respond to her. I knew she knew, though. After her fourth time asking, my fourth time not saying anything, she lightly slapped my shoulder and, with a voice that could stop traffic, said, "You didn't make a decision and reserve a caterer, did you?" I was so embarrassed, but I also wasn't about to prove her right. I was stubborn, and her need to be right all the time was almost as important as my need to prove her wrong whenever I could when it came to little stuff like this. I looked her in the eyes and as calmly as I could informed her that I had decided that we'd be eating Thai food on the night of our wedding. She seemed unsure about my answer, but that seemed good enough to get her off my back for the time being. She made it clear that she wasn't too pleased about my choice in food, but she didn't think that I would come through at all, so she was just happy that I chose something. That night, I told her that I'd be joining her in bed a little late because I had some stuff to attend to. In reality, that whole night was spent searching for a last-minute Thai caterer that hopefully I could call in the morning and book for the wedding. When morning came, I called 5 different Thai restaurants and asked if they could do it. They all said no, but the last one gave me the phone number to his aunt and said that she made great Thai food, and he was 90% certain that she could prepare enough food for the wedding with her family's help. I was skeptical at first, but I had no other options. There was no way I was going to tell Ella what was actually going on, so I called her. She told me she could do it, but it would cost around $10,000 for the short notice and the amount of food that she'd be making. It was a large wedding, and she told me that she'd have to get her brothers, sisters, and children on board with cooking to be able to finish it in time. After we hung up, I was actually pretty optimistic. The big day came, and I can't lie and say that I wasn't dreading it. I knew Ella would love it, but I also knew that I would hate it. But I was willing to do anything for her, even put up with the wedding and reception that were the opposite of what I would have wanted. The Thai food was dropped off at the reception venue early in the morning, and the wait staff was instructed on how to go about serving and reheating it. When I went to check on how everything worked out, it looked amazing. My wife even commented on how proud of me she was for coming through with what I had promised. It was time to eat, and everyone really enjoyed the food. It was worth the huge expense, and I felt pretty good about myself at that moment. But that feeling wouldn't last. After around 6 hours since the food had been served and toward the end of the reception, my wife came to me complaining of an upset stomach and told me that if I needed her, she'd be in the restroom. I figured it was a coincidence that my sister had come to me complaining of the same thing too, but I brushed it off. I could only brush it off for so long, though, until my own stomach began to hurt. I started to sweat, I became nauseous and was desperate to find the bathroom. When I found it, I realized other people were having the same problem too. The line for the bathroom was at least 30 people long and it just kept getting longer by the second. Even the porta potties outside had lines. That's when it began. I watched in horror as almost everyone who was attending the reception began to projectile vomit in every direction. These people were so sick and weren't even trying to aim away from each other. There were literally hundreds of us filling this venue, throwing up in every direction. It was covering the floors, the walls, the tables. The large room filled with the stench of the insides of people's stomachs. It was so bad, I remember my eyes began to water and my nose was even burning. I felt myself needing to throw up as well, and before I knew it, I was adding to the pool of sludge under my feet. It was like a scene from a terrible horror movie, and for a second, I thought maybe I was having a nightmare. At some point, someone ended up calling an ambulance and most people that had become sick elected to be taken to the hospital. I knew what had happened though. I immediately knew it was food poisoning and I didn't need a doctor to tell me that buying food from a random Thai lady who cooks in her own home maybe wasn't a good idea. I had unintentionally poisoned all these people. I couldn't help but feel bad as all these sick people were carted off to the hospital. Most ended up actually testing positive for E. coli. Some spent a good amount of time in the hospital and some went home that same day, but the outbreak was so big that I had to fess up. I told the police exactly what had happened. Unfortunately, some of the wedding guests most affected by the food poisoning did opt to sue. Myself, my wife, and the woman who cooked the food were held responsible for what had happened that night and were ordered to pay a large amount of money, which I won't disclose here, to the large list of guests that joined the lawsuit against us. The woman who cooked for us and her whole family were found to be illegal immigrants and were subsequently deported after their immigration status became known. My wife wouldn't even look at me for almost a week and wouldn't sleep in the same bed as me for almost a year. For a while there, I thought that she was going to divorce me for what I did. It's been around 6 years now and I learned my lesson. I feel extreme guilt every day for what had happened. I really should have just let my wife make the decisions. Being stubborn really doesn't pay off. On May 19th of 1884, a yacht known as the Mignonette departed the English port of Southampton bound for the coast of eastern Australia. Constructed in 1867, the 52-ton cruiser had been purchased by an Australian lawyer named Jack W., who sought a suitable crew to transport her to Sydney. But it was no small feat. Many experienced sailors noted that the yacht was an inshore boat unsuited to long voyages in open waters. And what's more, even the most experienced sailors were intimidated by the 15,000-mile journey, with many turning the job offer down before a full crew was finally assembled. In the end, a four-man team was put together, which consisted of Captain Tom Dudley, Edwin Stevens, Edmund Brooks, and a 17-year-old cabin boy by the name of Richard Parker. Almost 2 months into their journey, the crew of the Mignonette found themselves sailing into a gale around 1,600 miles northwest of South Africa's Cape of Good Hope. Despite the fierce winds, their journey was progressing steadily. Then, in order to enjoy a good night's sleep, Captain Dudley gave the order to heave to. In sailing, heaving to is a way of slowing a vessel's forward progress, as well as fixing the helm and sail position so that the vessel does not have to be steered, is commonly used as a way for sailors to take a break or to wait out strong or contrary winds. However, just as the maneuver was completed and young Richard Parker was sent below to prepare tea, a freak wave struck the Mignonette, damaging a bulkhead and causing vast amounts of seawater to flood into her hold. Realizing the yacht was doomed, Captain Dudley ordered his 3 crew members to man their single 13-foot lifeboat. The lifeboat was of flimsy construction, with its boards only a quarter-inch thick, but as the Mignonette began to list and groan, it proved the crew's only source of salvation. Just minutes later, the crew watched as the Mignonette disappeared below the waves, having managed to salvage nothing but a few pieces of navigational equipment and 2 tins of turnips. At first, Captain Dudley managed to stabilize the lifeboat by constructing an improvised sea anchor, a device reminiscent of a kind of waterborne parachute. It dragged behind the lifeboat, slowing its progress slightly and allowing for more effective manual steering. The captain also determined that they must have been around 700 miles from the nearest dry land, meaning that they were unlikely to be rescued anytime soon. During their first night at sea, the crew was forced to fight off a great white shark using nothing but their oars. The next morning, they were able to catch a sea turtle by simply dragging it out of the water. This yielded about 3 pounds of meat each, plus the bones, which, along with the tins of turnips, lasted until July 17th. The sailors planned on drinking the turtle blood to stave off fatal dehydration, but after it became contaminated with seawater, they began imbibing their own urine. By July 20th, the teenage cabin boy Richard Parker had become so sick of drinking his own urine that he began slurping up handfuls of seawater. This only exacerbated his dangerous levels of dehydration, and he fell unconscious shortly afterward. Around the same time that young Parker began to drift into unconsciousness, Dudley, Stevens, and Brooks began discussing the prospect of cannibalism. On July 24th, Dudley told the others that it was better for one of them to die so that the others would survive and suggested they should draw lots. Brooks refused, but that night, Dudley once again raised the matter and pointed out that while the childless cabin boy was most probably dying, he and Stevens had wives and families to take care of. The boy would be mourned, but unlike their women and children, his parents would not starve without his wages. This appeared to have been the most effective method of argument, as the next morning, Captain Dudley and Edwin Stevens made the decision to kill Richard Parker, ensuring his blood was fresh enough to drink. Brooks, who had refused to take part in the earlier discussion, claimed he neither agreed nor disagreed with the decision. Captain Dudley then said a prayer, and with Stevens holding the boy still in the event that he woke up, the captain pushed his penknife into Parker's jugular vein and ended his life. Once Parker's heart had ceased to beat, the 3 surviving sailors began butchering his body. Ironically, and despite his early reticence, it was reported that Edmund Brooks was ravenous in his consumption of Parker's flesh, while Edwin Stevens appeared to have a change of heart and ate very little. Speaking of the scene that followed, Captain Dudley later said, "I can assure you I shall never forget the sight of my 2 unfortunate companions over that ghastly meal. We were like mad wolves who should get the most, and for men, fathers of children, to commit such a deed, we could not have our right reason." Just a few days later, the survivors were still feasting on Parker's remains when they spotted the sail of a passing ship named the Monuma and successfully garnered its attention. Finally, on September 6, 1884, the Monuma sailed into Falmouth Harbor, where the 3 survivors of the Minette reported to a customs officer by the name of Mr. Cheeseman. Initially, the men were greeted with great relief, as it was assumed the Minette's crew had been lost when it failed to reach its Cape Town checkpoint. Yet, after explaining the grisly methods by which they had survived, the situation took a dramatic turn. Incredibly, the surviving crew members were remarkably candid regarding the retelling of the events and openly admitted to having murdered young Richard Parker before consuming his still warm flesh. Contemporary defense attorneys, who tend to limit their clients' vocabulary to the words "no" and "comment," would consider such a frank admission to be nothing short of madness. But although Captain Dudley and his 2 surviving crew members felt deep shame and guilt, they were comfortable in their confession because, in doing so, they invoked what was known as the custom of the sea. Since the very first days of humanity's oceanic exploration, accidents and misfortune has humbled even the hardiest of vessels, and those who survived their sinking ships either cast adrift or washed up on some far-flung shore were often faced with what was referred to as the delicate question, to eat or not to eat their dead or dying shipmates. Thankfully, only a very small number of seamen and explorers have been faced with such a grim situation. But with 19th century British culture being so centered around its maritime industries, such incidents became embedded into the public consciousness. For example, in the early 1600s, 7 English sailors were cruising through the Caribbean when they were blown out to sea and cast adrift for 17 days. When they reached the point of starvation, the sailors drew straws to decide who would sacrifice their flesh for the good of the collective. Ironically, the man chosen was the one who suggested the idea in the first place. According to his shipmates, he nobly consented and was swiftly put to death. The sailors survived on the man's flesh until they reached the Isle of St. Martin, and following repatriation to British territory, they were put on trial for murder. However, on the day of their hearing, the colonial judge showed a great deal of sympathy towards them, which, in turn, reflected the views of the wider public. The sailors were pardoned, with the judge stating their actions were of inevitable necessity. More than 200 years later, consuming one's dead shipmates in order to survive periods of deprivation became known as the tradition of the sea. As recently as August of 1874, the crew of the CR Yukon was said to have resorted to cannibalism after their ship went down off the coast of Western Australia. The governor of Singapore had ordered the surviving crew members arrested, and at first, the British government encouraged him to hold a judicial inquiry. However, when it came time to actually prosecuting the men, extended procedural wrangling meant that charges were eventually dropped. This was no accident. During this period, the influence of British Admiralty over their counterparts in government cannot be overstated. Many serving members of Parliament had been officers in Her Majesty's Royal Navy prior to their retirements, so naturally, they had a great deal of sympathy for the survivors of any shipwreck. This didn't mean sailors were free to murder and cannibalize as they pleased, but under the right circumstances, invoking the custom of the sea could prove a powerful defense. The surviving crew members of the Minette knew this all too well. Yet, after relaying their story of survival to the Falmouth customs officer, the deliciously named Mr. Cheeseman, the survivors found themselves standing before a police officer named Sergeant Laverty. They were informed that although they were not being placed under arrest, they were not permitted to leave Falmouth until the situation had been resolved. In the hours that followed, an emergency meeting of the harbor's commissioners yielded the following report. The police have apprehended Thomas Dudley, Ed Stevens, and E. Brooks of the yacht Minette on a charge of killing at sea on the 20th of July last the boy Richard Parker, after being for 18 days at sea with no food or drink. Summonses were also served on 2 seamen of the German bark Monuma as witnesses in the case, being those who cleared the boat of Parker. When news of the macabre story spread around Falmouth, there seemed to be a surprising amount of sympathy for the Minette survivors. When they were officially arrested, a local businessman named John Burton paid a generous amount to bail them out of prison. Even though he had eaten heartily of Parker's butchered flesh, there were deafening cries for clemency when it was heard that Edmund Brooks had refused to take part in the boy's murder. Brooks was acquitted, but despite the controversy, Stevens and Captain Dudley were to be put on trial for murder. Following their transfer to an Exeter courthouse, Stevens and Dudley were found guilty of Richard Parker's murder and condemned to hang. Yet, as one might imagine, the decision was met with outrage from both the Admiralty and the wider British public. Finally, after lengthy and considerable pressure, the death warrants for Stevens and Dudley were torn up and their sentences were reduced to a mere 6 months' imprisonment. The case of the Crown versus Dudley and Stevens is one of the few 19th-century criminal procedures still analyzed by law students today. It was also the inspiration for the name of the Bengal tiger in the novel Life of Pi. Some mistakenly believe that the case also inspired Edgar Allan Poe's only complete novel, The Narrative of Arthur Gordon Pym of Nantucket, and it's easy to understand why. Told from the perspective of the anonymous Gordon Pym, it recounts the tale of a perilous sea voyage in which, following a mutiny and monstrous storm, Pym finds himself in charge of the ship's battered remains and accompanied by just 3 others: Augustus Peters and a young cabin boy by the name of Richard Parker. Halfway through the novel, having survived for days on nothing but scraps of turtle meat and drops of fresh water, the desperate survivors are forced to invoke the so-called custom of the sea and begin drawing lots to determine the victim. In the end, it comes down to just Gordon Pym and Richard Parker, and it is Parker who is chosen to be eaten. Yet, the narrative of Arthur Gordon Pym of Nantucket was not published in the aftermath of the Mignonette sinking. It was published in 1838, a full 46 years before the Mignonette sank and 29 years before Richard Parker, the ill-fated cabin boy, was even conceived. Some suggested this was evidence of Poe's supposed morbid prescience, a symptom of his ever-lingering genius. But perhaps such a coincidence is suggestive of the repetitive and inevitable nature of the event itself. For, since the very first days of humanity's oceanic exploration, accidents and misfortune have humbled even the hardiest of vessels. And so perhaps those who survived disasters involving interstellar starships who ended up stranded on some far-flung shore will once again be faced with what was once referred to as the delicate question. I live on the east coast of the United States. Recently, I moved to Florida from Georgia and figured it would take a couple of days to sail my boat down there to our new waterfront house. I didn't have any cars with a tow hitch to carry the boat, let alone a trailer to carry it with, so sailing it seemed like the best option. While my wife finished up moving the rest of the stuff to our new house, I kissed my family goodbye and set sail. None of them were really willing to come with me on this adventure, and I didn't blame them. But anyway, I brought enough food and gas to last me the whole trip. The first day was a breeze. I got some sleep, then sailed for 10 hours the next day, with breaks in between, of course. By nightfall, I went to bed in the cabin. Sleeping in a rocking boat isn't exactly the easiest thing to do, so I was up for hours rolling around on my sides, trying to find a comfortable position, trying to press my head firmly enough into the pillow, thinking it would hide the unbearable feeling of the boat rocking over the ocean surface. Eventually, I heard sounds coming from above my head that I could best describe as small thumps, and it sounded like someone walking on my boat. I couldn't tell yet. With a medium-sized fishing boat floating out in the ocean, random sounds like creaks and thumps are going to be made, but these thumps were coming so rapidly and consistently. I started to get sick with the thought that someone out this far could be on my boat. I had to get out and look, but I wanted to be quiet. So, I opened the cabin door very slowly. But before I could even open it all the way, I heard a big splash in the water. It sounded to me like someone or something jumped into the water. I was honestly scared I wasn't alone, even though it made no sense to me. I didn't want to go outside. I felt I should move the boat away from whoever or whatever was out there in the water. So, I ran outside to the cockpit and started the boat engine. I gave the boat some gas and got myself the hell away from there immediately. I heard my boat bump into something in the water. Not something heavy enough to cause any kind of impact, but heavy enough to hear it and slightly feel the boat bump. I didn't see what it was because, to be honest, I wasn't paying attention to whatever was out in the water. Plus, the lights weren't on anyway. I sailed for a few hours in the deep night because I was wide awake anyway. When I started to get tired, I killed the motor and went back to bed. Emphasis on the word bed, not sleep, because even though I felt tired, I was still having trouble falling asleep. I figure half an hour passed, and I started hearing more thumps. This time, the thumps seemed louder and more clear for some reason. In a split second, my heart started racing again. The thumps were consistent and deliberate sounding. Again, no way it was just boat noises. I felt like I was being followed by someone. I couldn't just sit there and hide in the cabin like this all night. I had to sum up the courage to go outside again. But when I checked, there was no one on the entire boat. Was it my imagination? Were these sounds really just coming from the boat? I decided that must have been the case and once again went back inside the cabin to bed. I lay there extremely silent now, trying to listen for any little noise. When I did this, I heard something. I knew I did. It wasn't the sound of thumping or anything like that. I had to perk up my ears to really pay attention. I figured out what I was hearing. It wasn't the sound of the wind outside or the water hitting the boat. It was the sound of someone breathing. It was not the sound of my breathing, but someone else's. It was coming from inside the cabin. Of course, I panicked, but I tried to maintain composure so as not to make it obvious. I got out from the bed, walked outside the cabin, and locked myself in the cockpit. I intended on sailing until I could find a dock by the shore. There's a small window that looks into the cockpit from the cabin. It has a curtain. I turned to it every minute or so, at least once, to look back at it, expecting to see someone watching me. One of the times I looked back, I did see someone. The curtain was curved up a little bit in the corner, and I saw someone's eye and maybe a quarter of their face peeking into the cockpit. I turned away right away, acting like I didn't see them. I had the thought, what if it was my young son trying to scare me? But it wouldn't make sense. I saw him waving goodbye when I set sail from the house. It was 3 or 4 tense hours of hell, thinking at any moment someone could break into the cockpit and stab me. But I made it to shore and sailed through the narrow canal. I had already called the cops 15 minutes earlier, requesting they have a few officers waiting at the dock I was headed to. It was still dark out, but I saw people standing on the dock, and I couldn't have been more excited to get there. When I stopped the boat next to the dock, I came out from the cockpit, screaming at the officers to help, pointing at the cabin door. The 2 officers went into the cabin with their hands on their pistols. 10 seconds later, I heard them yelling at someone. They pulled out some guy with really long gray wet hair and a similar beard, wearing wet skinny ripped jeans and a gray t-shirt. They had him in cuffs. As they walked him past me, he looked at me and just laughed this insanely off-putting laugh. The guy looked and sounded like a meth head, the best way I could describe him. The police questioned him, but he never answered anything as to how or when he got on my boat or what he was trying to do. But thinking back, when I heard breathing in my cabin, it's likely he was hiding under my bed, and that's the most horrifying thought imaginable. By then, I was exhausted and went back to my cabin and fell asleep right away. By late morning, I made it to the new house, and my nightmarish adventure was over. Back in late August of 1989, my friend and I set out on a 3-week sailing trip. Our job was to sail a 40-ton yacht named Tamaro from French Polynesia to San Francisco, and we were being paid handsomely to do so. We had years of sailing experience between us, but the 5,000-mile journey was the furthest either of us had ever been on. We were confident that we could do it, but early on, there was a worrying change in the weather's forecast. Statistically, hurricanes happened really late in the South Pacific and tend to arrive in mid to late October, so by setting sail in late August, we figured that we'd avoid the worst of the bad weather. But as the saying goes, man proposes and God disposes. 3 weeks into our voyage, we were faced with a Category 4 hurricane, which whipped up waves as high as 20-story buildings. We'd sailed through gales and storms before, but never a hurricane. We tried to escape it for 3 days, but the boat could only go 15 miles per hour, and so eventually, it caught up with us. It was too late for us to turn around and escape, so we had no choice but to brave it head-on. We put on our raincoats and boarded up the yacht, all while 140 miles per hour winds and 40-foot waves battered against the boat. The wind and rain felt like BB pellets on our skin, and it was like nothing we'd ever felt before. But we were still confident of being able to handle the situation. We just had to wait for the worst to be over. At one point, I remember heading below deck to get something, and then I suddenly heard my fiancé yell out, "Oh my God." We got caught in a massive wave. I was thrown off my feet, and the last thing I remember is my head smashing into something before everything just went fuzzy. I think I must have been out for a minute or two because when I woke up, there was blood all over my face and raincoat, and I was lying on the floor. I couldn't hear my fiancé, so I went topside to check on him. The last I'd seen of him, he was strapping himself into the safety harness, but when I went to check on him, the harness was empty and he was nowhere to be seen. I remember screaming, but I knew I had to pull myself together. There'd be time to grieve later, and if I didn't focus on the task ahead of me, people would end up grieving me too. I knew the yacht had suffered irreparable damage that would make it impossible to sail. The navigation system, engine, and even the sails were all waterlogged or shredded beyond repair. But even worse, the yacht itself was taking on water at crazy speeds. My instincts kicked in, and I started pumping water out of the cabin before using the storm jib and a broken pole to create an improvised sail. The only tools I had at hand were a sextant and a watch, but I had enough sailing experience to use them to navigate to land. After 41 days of drifting in the Pacific, rationing my canned food and water, I finally spotted land. It turned out to be the Hawaiian island of Hilo, and as I slowly drifted towards the harbor, I was spotted by a Japanese ship and rescued. For weeks afterward, I kept one of my fiancé's old shirts wrapped around my pillow. His scent was the only thing that got me through. I put all the pain and grief to the back of my mind, and once I was safe, it all came gushing out of me like water through a broken dam. It took me many years to get back to sailing, and these days I'm much more cautious about the jobs I accept. I thought about retiring from it altogether, but after a while, I realized that it's where I belong. If there's one silver lining to the dark cloud of my fiancé's tragic death, it's that he went out doing what he loved most. Thanks for watching the video. Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications to watch the latest videos.